3 years ago, my fiancé died in a fire. Or so I thought. The man standing in front of me has his face, his voice, his hands, but he doesn't remember me. He calls himself Arden Voss. He works night shifts, lives in a single room, exists like a ghost, and then we find it. A safety deposit box, rented under a false name. Inside, $2 million. 17 victims. A journal written in his handwriting. I chose to hurt her rather than face the consequences of my own actions. He was a thief, a coward, a man who burned down his entire life to escape. But the man I'm falling for isn't him. He's someone who cleans hospital floors at 3 a.m., someone who returned every stolen dollar, someone who looks at me like I'm real, not a role to play. They say you can't love a ghost, but what if the ghost becomes someone new? What if redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about what you build from the ashes? Ashes of always. A dark romance about memory, guilt, and the stubborn persistence of love. Prologue: The Ash and the Silence. The night Kier Ashford died, Maren Holt learned that the human body can continue performing its functions even when the soul has already evacuated. She stood. She breathed. She blinked when smoke stung her eyes. But the part of her that made these actions matter had gone somewhere else, somewhere the flames couldn't reach. The Ashford estate burned with a hunger that seemed almost sentient. Maren watched from the gravel drive, wrapped in a wool blanket someone had draped across her shoulders. She didn't remember who, didn't remember arriving at this particular spot, didn't remember the moment when watching became all she was capable of doing. The fire ate through centuries-old stone, as if it were paper, sent timber beams crashing into rooms where she and Kier had planned their future. The heat reached her even at this distance, a physical pressure against her face, her chest, her hands. She should move back. Someone had probably told her to move back. She didn't move. "Miss Holt?" A firefighter approached, his face streaked with soot, his eyes careful in the way people's eyes became careful around the bereaved. "We need you to step back to the road. It's not safe here." Safe. The word had no meaning anymore. "He got out," she said. Her voice sounded normal. "That seemed wrong. You said he got out." "We found no one inside. The staff evacuated. Mr. Ashford's car is gone from the garage." The firefighter glanced at his colleagues, then back at Maren. "He likely left before the fire spread. We'll locate him, but right now, he would have come for me." The firefighter's expression shifted into something that might have been pity. Maren looked away before she could identify it with certainty. Pity required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required feeling, and feeling was a door she couldn't open. Not yet. Not while the flames were still visible. "Please, Miss Holt, the structure is unstable." She let herself be guided backward, toward the cluster of emergency vehicles and neighbors who had gathered like witnesses to an execution. Someone pressed a bottle of water into her hands. Someone else asked if there was anyone they should call. Maren answered. She must have answered, because people nodded and moved away. But she couldn't hear her own words over the roar of the fire and the silence where Kier should have been. "He would have come for me." The thought circled, a bird of prey hunting for a place to land. Kier wouldn't leave without telling her. They'd been at the estate together that afternoon, discussing which rooms to renovate first after the wedding. He'd kissed her in the library, pressed her against the shelves that now were ash, murmured plans against her throat. Then his phone had rung. His lawyer, something about papers that needed signing, and he'd asked her to wait while he dealt with it. "Just an hour," he'd said. "2 at most. Then we'll drive into town, have dinner at that place you like." She'd left him in his study, surrounded by documents she hadn't looked at closely. She'd driven home to change clothes. She'd taken a shower. She'd chosen a dress. And when she'd tried to call him to say she was ready, the call went straight to voicemail. 20 minutes later, her phone had lit up with alerts. Fire at the Ashford estate, multiple units responding. She'd driven back with her hair still damp, her dress half zipped, her heart a fist in her chest. And now she stood behind a police cordon, watching everything burn, and Kier was gone, and no one could tell her where. The fire burned through the night. Maren stayed, even when the neighbors drifted away, even when the firefighters stopped trying to save the structure and focused only on containing the spread. She stayed because leaving felt like a betrayal, like abandoning Kier to the flames. Even though logic said he wasn't there, he'd gotten out, his car was gone. His car was gone. She held on to that. His car was gone, which meant he'd driven away, which meant he was alive somewhere, probably trying to call her, probably frantic. Her phone was in her hand. The screen stayed dark. Dawn came gradually, turning the smoke gray instead of black. The fire had exhausted itself, leaving behind a skeleton of stone walls and nothing else. Everything wooden, everything beautiful, everything that had made the estate a home, gone. The head firefighter approached Maren as orange light bled across the ruins. "We'll begin a thorough search once it's cooled enough," he said. "But Miss Holt, you should prepare yourself. Fire's this intense. If someone was trapped inside, there may not be remains to recover." "He wasn't inside," Maren said. Her voice was steady. She marveled at that steadiness, the way her body continued to function as a convincing imitation of a living person. "His car is gone. We'll verify that. We'll check hospitals, hotels, anywhere he might have gone. Try to get some rest. We'll contact you as soon as we know anything." Rest. Another word that had lost its meaning. Maren drove home in the dress she'd chosen for dinner, the dress she'd never worn for its intended purpose. She walked through her apartment, a small place she'd been planning to leave once she and Kier married, once she moved into the estate that no longer existed, and everything looked exactly as she'd left it. The mundane persistence of her belongings seemed obscene. How dare her coffee cup sit clean in the dish rack? How dare her mail wait in a neat stack on the counter? How dare the world continue as if nothing had ended? She didn't sleep. She sat on her couch and watched her phone and waited for Kier to call. He didn't call. The days that followed had a fever dream quality, events occurring in sequences that Maren observed but didn't quite inhabit. The fire inspector came to her apartment with questions she answered automatically. "When did you last see Mr. Ashford? What was his state of mind? Did he mention any problems, any concerns?" She told them about the lawyer's call, the documents, the plan for dinner. She didn't mention the way Kier had seemed distracted lately, the way he'd startled at unexpected sounds, the way she'd sometimes caught him staring at nothing with an expression she couldn't read. Those details felt private, sacred, not for strangers to dissect. Kier's family lawyer appeared next, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone delivering a diagnosis. He sat across from Maren at her small dining table and explained things she couldn't quite process. The estate had been insured, heavily. Kier had no siblings, and his parents had died years ago. There were debts, substantial debts, but the insurance would cover them, and Maren, as Kier's fiancé, was listed as a beneficiary on several accounts. "We need to discuss the possibility," the lawyer said carefully, "that Mr. Ashford may have perished in the fire. They found no body. Fires of that temperature can consume human remains entirely. It's not uncommon. If Mr. Ashford was in the study when the fire started, if he was overcome by smoke before he could escape, his car was gone." The lawyer consulted his notes. The garage was investigated. They found tire tracks suggesting a vehicle left recently, but we have no confirmation it was Mr. Ashford who drove it. The car itself hasn't been located. So he's alive. He drove away. Perhaps, or perhaps someone else took the vehicle. We're exploring all possibilities. The lawyer removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief. "Miss Holt, I understand this is difficult, but there are practicalities we need to address. If Mr. Ashford doesn't resurface within a certain time frame, we'll need to begin proceedings to declare him legally deceased." Legally deceased, as if death were a bureaucratic status rather than an ending. "How long?" Maren asked. "The standard period is 7 years, but given the circumstances we may be able to expedite." 7 years. She would wait 7 years. 700. She would wait until the waiting itself became its own form of life, a purpose to fill the days. The lawyer left her with papers she didn't read and a check she didn't cash. She added them to the growing pile of things that required attention she couldn't summon. Her phone rang constantly. Friends, colleagues, distant relatives who hadn't spoken to her in years, but now called to offer condolences for a death that hadn't been confirmed. She stopped answering. 3 weeks after the fire, the search of the ruins concluded. The fire inspector came to her apartment again, this time with a police officer. They sat in the same chairs the lawyer had occupied, and they told her that they'd found no human remains. They'd found evidence of accelerant in multiple locations. The fire had been deliberately set. Arson. "We need to ask," the police officer said, "whether Mr. Ashford had any enemies. Anyone who might have wanted to harm him or his property." Marin thought of Kier's easy charm, his careful politeness, the way he'd navigated social situations with the grace of someone who'd been trained since childhood to make people comfortable. No, everyone liked him. What about financial troubles? The lawyer mentioned debts. He was managing them. He never seemed worried. This was a lie. Kier had seemed worried, but Marin couldn't articulate how she'd known. It was in the spaces between words, the things he didn't say. The officer wrote something in a small notebook. "And you didn't notice anything unusual the day of the fire? Nothing that seemed out of place?" Just the phone call. From his lawyer. But he took calls from his lawyer often. "We'll need to speak with the lawyer, verify the call occurred." They asked more questions, Marin answered. Eventually they left, and she was alone again with the silence and the not knowing. The memorial service happened on a gray afternoon 6 weeks after the fire. No body meant no funeral, just a gathering of people who had known Kier, who spoke about him in past tense, while Marin sat in the front row and felt nothing. A colleague gave a eulogy that reduced Kier's life to accomplishments and anecdotes. Someone else read a poem. Marin didn't hear the words. She was listening for Kier's voice, for the sound of him arriving late and apologetic, explaining that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that he was alive, he was here, he was sorry. He didn't come. After the service, people approached Marin with embraces and murmured sympathies. She accepted them with the same mechanical grace she'd applied to everything else. Someone asked if she was eating enough. Someone else asked if she'd considered grief counseling. She said yes to things she had no intention of doing and thanked people for caring she couldn't feel. That night, alone in her apartment, Marin finally cried. Not from grief. Grief would have required accepting that Kier was gone, and she wasn't ready for that. She cried from exhaustion, from the relentless performance of continuing to exist, from the terrible suspicion that had been growing in the dark spaces of her mind. His car was gone. The fire was arson. He'd never called. What if he'd left deliberately? What if the fire was meant to erase something? Debts, obligations, a life he no longer wanted. What if she was mourning someone who had chosen to disappear? The thought was poison. She couldn't swallow it, couldn't spit it out. It lived in her throat, choking her. 3 months after the fire, Marin returned to work. She was an archivist for the County Historical Society, a job that involved cataloging the belongings of the dead, estate sales, donated collections, the accumulated debris of finished lives. Her supervisor had told her to take all the time she needed. Marin took 12 weeks, then ran out of reasons to stay home. The work was perfect for her new internal geography. It required precision without emotion, attention without investment. She could spend hours photographing and categorizing objects, jewelry, letters, photographs, books, without once having to acknowledge her own feelings. The dead didn't require her to perform grief. They simply needed to be documented, organized, filed away. She became very good at filing things away. Time moved. Seasons changed. The first anniversary of the fire came and went. Marin marked it alone, standing at the ruins of the estate. Now cleared, the land sold to pay Kier's debts. Nothing remained except the stone foundation and the wildflowers that had begun to colonize the ash. She didn't visit again. 3 years passed. Marin's life took on a monastic quality. Work, sleep, the bare minimum of human interaction required to maintain her job and her apartment. Friends stopped calling after their overtures were met with polite deflection. She dated no one. She wanted no one. Desire had burned away with everything else. She told herself she was fine. She told herself this was simply who she was now, a woman who archived the dead and asked nothing from the living. She told herself these lies with enough conviction that she almost believed them. And then one Tuesday in October, her supervisor called her into his office and said, "There's someone here asking about the Ashford estate fire. Says he's looking for archived belongings. I told him you'd handled that collection." Marin's hands went numb. "Did he give a name?" she asked. "Yeah. Arden Voss. Says he thinks he might have been there when it happened. Apparently he's got some kind of amnesia, trying to piece things together." Her supervisor shrugged. "Probably nothing, but I thought you'd want to know before I sent him your way." Marin stood. Her chair scraped against the floor. "When is he coming back?" "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Her supervisor looked at her with concern that she didn't want. "You okay? I can have someone else handle it if this is too." "No, I'll do it." She left work early, went home, stood in her shower until the water ran cold. When she finally slept, she dreamed of fire and a voice calling her name, a voice she'd spent 3 years trying to forget, trying to preserve, trying to understand, had left her deliberately. In the dream, she never found the source of the voice. At 8:45 the next morning, Marin arrived at the archives. She'd chosen her clothes carefully. Professional, neutral, armor against whatever was coming. She made coffee she didn't drink. She arranged the Ashford files on her desk with hands that trembled despite her best efforts. At 9 o'clock exactly, the door opened. And Kier Ashford walked in from the dead. Chapter 1. The Man Who Isn't Dead. He was thinner than she remembered. That was Marin's first coherent thought, after the initial shock had detonated in her chest and left her lungs struggling to remember their purpose. The man standing in the doorway of the archive had Kier's height, Kier's dark hair, longer now, unstyled, falling across his forehead in a way Kier never would have allowed, and Kier's particular way of holding himself, weight slightly more on his left foot, shoulders carrying a tension that spoke of vigilance rather than ease. But he was thinner. The angles of his face were sharper, cheekbones more prominent, and there was a scar along his jaw that hadn't existed 3 years ago. A pale line that curved from his ear toward his chin, like a cartographer's marking on unexplored territory. "Good morning," he said, and it was Kier's voice. That was Kier's voice, the same slight rasp, the same cadence, and Marin's coffee cup slipped from her fingers. It didn't break. It hit the desk and rolled, spilling lukewarm coffee across the files she'd so carefully arranged. She watched the brown liquid spread across paper, soaking into 3 years of archived grief, and couldn't move to stop it. The man, Kier, not Kier, whoever he was, moved quickly, grabbing tissues from the box on her desk, blotting at the spill with an efficiency that suggested this was the kind of small crisis he knew how to handle. The larger crises, apparently, left him just as lost as everyone else. "I'm sorry," he said, still focused on the coffee. "I startled you. I should have knocked." Marin found her voice hiding somewhere behind her heart. The door was open. Still. He looked up then, and their eyes met for the first time, and Marin watched for recognition that didn't come. His eyes were the same. That particular gray-green that shifted depending on the light that she'd once told him reminded her of the sea before a storm, but they looked at her with the polite concern of a stranger who'd caused a minor accident. Nothing more. "You must be the archivist," he continued when she didn't speak. "My name is Arden Voss. I called yesterday about the Ashford estate records." Arden Voss. He said it with certainty, as if this name belonged to him, as if he'd carried it his entire life, instead of stealing it from whatever grave Kier Ashford had tried to dig for himself. "Yes," Marin managed. "I'm Marin Holt." She watched for a reaction. There was none. Her name meant nothing to him, just as her face meant nothing, just as the 3 years they'd spent building a future together had apparently meant nothing enough that he could erase them completely. "Ms. Holt." He extended his hand. Marin stared at it. That hand had touched every part of her. That hand had held hers during the drive to choose her engagement ring. That hand had traced patterns on her back while she fell asleep. And now it was being offered to her like they were strangers meeting in a professional context, like there was nothing between them except coffee-stained files and the polite fiction that he didn't know her. She took it. His skin was warm, his grip firm but not aggressive. When she pulled away, she could still feel the ghost of his touch, and she hated herself for wanting to reach out again. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "You said you're looking for information about the Ashford estate fire?" He sat, and she noted the way he positioned himself, close enough to be conversational, far enough to maintain boundaries. Kier had always been particular about personal space with strangers. Apparently, something survived whatever had happened to him. "I am," he said. "I understand this might seem unusual, but I have gaps in my memory. The past 3 years are mostly missing. I was found about 200 miles from here, near a beach town, with no identification and significant injuries. The doctors said head trauma, likely from an accident. I've been trying to piece together where I came from, and I recently found a reference to the Ashford fire that made me think I might have been connected to it somehow." His voice was measured, practiced. He'd told this story before, Marin realized. He'd refined it into something that conveyed the essential facts, without inviting too many follow-up questions. But there was something underneath the practiced delivery, a wariness, a sense of someone navigating a conversation while simultaneously watching for exits. "What kind of reference?" Marin asked. "A newspaper clipping. I had it in my pocket when I was found, along with a book." He reached into his jacket, Kier's jacket, or at least the same brand Kier used to wear, and withdrew a plastic sleeve containing a yellowed piece of newsprint. He slid it across the desk. Marin picked it up with hands that had stopped trembling and started towards something worse, a steadiness born of shock rather than calm. The headline read, "Historic Ashford Estate Destroyed in Suspicious Fire." Below it was a photo of the ruins, smoke still rising from the stone skeleton. "The book was a novel," Arden continued, "a thriller about a man who fakes his death. The protagonist's name was Arden Voss. He paused, and for the first time, genuine uncertainty crossed his face. "I know it sounds absurd, but when I woke up in the hospital and they asked my name, that was the only name in my head. The doctors thought maybe I'd been reading it before whatever happened to me, and the name stuck, so I kept it. Better than John Doe." Marin set down the clipping. "And you think you were at the estate when the fire happened?" "I don't know, but I've had fragments, dreams maybe, or memories. Fire, pain, the smell of smoke, and this sense that I ran from something, or towards something. I can't tell which." He leaned forward slightly. "I was hoping the estate records might contain something that would help. A list of people who were there, staff members, anyone who might have gone missing around the same time as the fire." "The staff all evacuated safely," Marin said. Each word felt like a stone she was laying carefully, building a wall between what she knew and what she could say. They were questioned by police. None of them were injured. "And the owner? Kier Ashford?" Hearing that name in his voice, in Kier's voice speaking about Kier as if he were someone else, created a cognitive dissonance so severe that Marin felt the room tilt slightly. She gripped the edge of her desk. "Are you all right?" Arden asked. "Fine. Just the coffee. I should clean it up properly." She stood, needing the movement, needing to do something with her hands other than reach across the desk and grab him, and demand to know if this was real or some elaborate cruelty. She went to the supply closet, found cleaning solution and paper towels, and took several deep breaths that did nothing to steady her pulse. When she returned, Arden was looking at the files spread across her desk, the files she'd been planning to show him, evidence of a life he claimed not to remember. "You've kept extensive records," he observed. "It's my job." Marin began wiping down the desk with more force than necessary. The Ashford estate was historically significant. When it was destroyed, the Historical Society acquired what remained of the family's belongings for preservation and cataloging. I was assigned to the collection. "Were you familiar with the family before the fire?" The question was casual, but Marin heard the weight beneath it. He was fishing, trying to understand why this stranger was reacting to him with barely concealed shock. She could lie. She could tell him no, she'd simply been assigned the project, she had no personal connection. She could maintain the professional distance and let him walk out of the archive and back into whatever life he'd built as Arden Voss, and she could continue her careful, numb existence without this disruption. Instead, she reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a photograph. "Kier Ashford didn't die in the fire," she said, sliding the photo across the desk. "At least, no body was ever found. His car was missing. The fire was ruled arson, but no one was ever charged." Arden picked up the photograph. It showed Kier and Marin, 2 months before the fire, on the day they'd gotten engaged. They were standing in the garden of the estate, now ashes, and Kier's arms were wrapped around Marin from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, both of them smiling at the camera with the unconscious ease of people who believed the future would unfold exactly as they'd planned. "This is Kier Ashford," Marin continued, "and that's me. We were engaged. We were going to be married 3 weeks after the fire happened." She watched him study the photograph. His expression was difficult to read, not blank, but carefully controlled, as if he were analyzing evidence rather than looking at his own face. "We look happy," he said quietly. "We were." "I'm sorry," he set down the photo. "I'm sorry for your loss." "I haven't lost anything," Marin leaned forward. "Because that's you. You're Kier Ashford. I don't know why you're calling yourself Arden Voss, or why you're pretending not to remember, but I know your face. I know your voice. I know the way you hold yourself, the way you—" She stopped, aware that her voice had risen, that her careful composure was fracturing. Arden Kier, whoever he was, didn't look alarmed. If anything, his expression held a terrible gentleness, the kind reserved for someone having a breakdown. "Ms. Holt," he said, "Marin, I understand how this must look, how I must look, but I promise you, I'm not pretending. I don't remember you. I don't remember this man, or this engagement, or anything that happened before I woke up in that hospital 3 years ago." He picked up the photograph again. "I've looked at this face in mirrors every day. I know it belongs to me, in the sense that it's the face I see, but it doesn't feel like mine. It feels like I'm wearing it. Does that make sense?" "No." "I know." He set the photo down. "I've been to neurologists. They've done brain scans, cognitive tests, everything. The diagnosis is retrograde amnesia, likely caused by the head trauma. It's not uncommon with severe injuries. Sometimes memories return. Sometimes they don't." He met her eyes. "I'm not trying to hurt you by not remembering. I'm simply telling you what's true for me." Marin sat back down. The chair felt insubstantial beneath her, as if the entire world had become uncertain in its physics. "Medical records," she said. "You said you have medical records." "From the hospital where I was treated. I can provide them if you need proof that I'm not." He paused. "Whatever you think I am." "I think you're the man I was going to marry. I think you disappeared the night of the fire, and now you're back, and I don't understand why you're lying about not remembering." "I'm not lying." "Then you're mistaken, confused. The trauma, maybe it's temporary. Maybe if you spend time here, look at familiar things, see familiar places." "Marin." His use of her first name, spoken with Kier's inflection, was a wound. "I've tried that. In the past year, I've visited 3 different towns where I thought I might have lived. I've looked at photographs, spoken to people who claim to know me. walked through places that supposedly held significance. Nothing has triggered recognition. Not once. He leaned back, and the exhaustion in his posture was real, undeniable. I came here looking for information, not this. I didn't know about you. I'm sorry. They sat in silence. Marin's mind was racing, trying to process the impossible. Kier was alive. Kier didn't remember her. Kier had become someone else, someone who looked at her with a stranger's eyes and apologized for not being who he was. What do you remember? She finally asked. From before the hospital? Nothing concrete, impressions mostly. Cold, water, the smell of gasoline. He touched the scar on his jaw absently. Pain, running. I don't know if I was running from something or toward it. And he hesitated. What? Guilt. I remember feeling like I'd done something unforgivable, and I needed to disappear because of it. He looked at her. Does that match with the man you knew? Marin thought about the Kier she'd loved. Charming, attentive, careful. She thought about the Kier of those final weeks. Distracted, tense, taking calls he wouldn't explain. She thought about the debts his lawyer had mentioned, the accelerant found at multiple points in the fire. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe. Toward the end, he was different, worried about something he wouldn't discuss. I thought it was just wedding stress or family finances. I didn't push. Maybe you should have. The words weren't cruel, just factual, but they landed like an accusation anyway. Maybe she should have. Maybe if she'd pushed harder, asked better questions, paid closer attention, he wouldn't have set fire to his entire life and disappeared into amnesia and a stolen name. I need to see your medical records, Marin said. I need to verify that you're telling the truth about the amnesia. Of course. Arden reached for his phone. I can email them to you. What's your address? She gave it to him. He typed quickly, efficiently, then set down the phone. Done. You should have them in a few minutes. Thank you. Is there anything else you need from me? The question was professional, courteous. It made Marin want to scream. What did she need? She needed the past 3 years to unmake themselves. She needed Kier to walk through the door and explain that this had all been a terrible mistake. She needed to understand how a person could look at someone they'd loved and feel nothing but polite concern. The files, she said instead. You wanted to see the estate files. If it's not too much trouble. It was too much trouble. It was unbearable. But Marin pulled the boxes from the shelf behind her desk anyway, setting them in front of Kier, who was Arden, with hands that had returned to their earlier trembling. These are the family documents that survived the fire, she explained. Financial records, correspondence, photographs. Most of it is damaged by smoke or water, but I've cataloged what's legible. Arden opened the first box carefully, as if the contents might be fragile, which they were, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. The first item he withdrew was a letter, written in Kier's handwriting. Marin had read it a dozen times while cataloging. It was addressed to Kier's father, who died 5 years before the fire. The letter discussed business concerns, family obligations, the weight of inheritance. The tone was respectful but strained. Arden read it silently, then looked at the signature. This is my handwriting, he said. I recognize it. I've been writing with this same hand for 3 years, but seeing it like this, older, different, it's strange. Do you remember writing it? No. He set it aside, moved to the next item. A photograph of a young Kier, maybe 8 or 9, standing with his parents in front of the estate. He studied it the way an anthropologist might study artifacts of an extinct culture, with interest, but no personal connection. They went through the box methodically. Birth certificates, school records, awards for academic achievement, a diary from Kier's adolescence that Marin had only skimmed, feeling invasive even 3 years after his disappearance. Arden read it all with the same careful detachment, occasionally making a note on his phone, never showing recognition. When they reached the photographs of Marin and Kier together, and there were many, because they'd been the kind of couple who documented everything, he paused longer. We look, he stopped, searching for the right word. In love? Marin supplied. Comfortable, like we'd known each other a long time. 2 years. We met at a charity auction. You bid on a first edition of Wuthering Heights I'd authenticated. You won, then asked if I'd have dinner with you to discuss it. Did I like Wuthering Heights? You'd never read it. You just wanted an excuse to talk to me. For the first time, something that might have been emotion crossed Arden's face. Not memory, but something else. Regret, maybe. Or loss for a life he couldn't access. That sounds like something a person who was very sure of himself would do, he said. I'm not that person anymore. What kind of person are you? He considered the question seriously. Careful, uncertain. Someone who knows he's built on a foundation that isn't real, that could collapse at any moment. He set down the photograph. I work as a night cleaner at a hospital. I live in a single room above a laundromat. I have no friends, because friendships require a past, and I don't have one I can share. I exist. That's about all I can claim. The description was devastating in its loneliness. This was what Kier had become, a man so isolated he'd built an entire identity around absence. You had friends, Marin said. Before, you were, popular isn't the right word, but people were drawn to you. You made them feel comfortable. I believe you, but that person isn't accessible to me. This is who I am now. Marin's phone chimed. The medical records had arrived. She opened them on her computer, pulling up scans and reports and doctor's notes. Everything Arden had said was corroborated. Severe head trauma. Burns on his arms and back, consistent with fire exposure. Hypothermia. He'd been found on a beach, unconscious, by someone walking their dog early in the morning. No identification, no phone, just the book and the newspaper clipping. The doctor's notes were clinical but not unsympathetic. Patient exhibits complete retrograde amnesia. No recall of personal information, relationships, or events prior to admission. Cognitive function otherwise normal. Prognosis for memory recovery uncertain. It's real, Marin said, more to herself than to him. I wouldn't lie about this. People lie about all kinds of things. Not this. Not when the truth is already painful enough. She looked at him, really looked, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from her with the man she'd loved. The physical similarities were undeniable, but there were differences beyond the weight loss and the scar. The way he held himself was more guarded. His voice, though the same in tone, was emptier somehow, missing some essential warmth, and his eyes, when they met hers, held none of the recognition that should have been there, the accumulation of shared moments and private jokes and a future they'd planned together. He was Kier, but he was also genuinely, impossibly, someone else. What happens now? Arden asked. Marin didn't have an answer. What did happen now? She'd spent 3 years mourning a dead man, and that man was sitting across from her, alive but absent in ways that death couldn't have achieved. I don't know, she said. I can leave, if this is too difficult. No, the word came out sharper than she intended. No. I need time to process this. But I have more files, more photographs, things that might help you understand who you were. Were? He repeated. Not am. You're still him. Even if you don't remember, you're still... I'm not. His voice was gentle but firm. Memory is what makes us who we are. Without it, I'm just a body that looks like someone you knew. I'm sorry if that's not what you want to hear, but it's the truth, as I understand it. Marin felt tears threatening and forced them back. She would not cry in front of this stranger wearing Kier's face. She would not give him the satisfaction, though that was unfair. He didn't want to hurt her. He was simply telling the truth, and the truth was more painful than any lie could have been. When can you come back? She asked. Arden looked surprised. You want me to come back? You said you were looking for information about who you were. I have that information, 3 years of it, cataloged and preserved. If you want answers, I can provide them, she met his eyes, unless you'd rather stay Arden Voss. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm not sure what I'd rather. I've spent 3 years building a life, even if it's a small one. Learning I was someone else. Someone with obligations, relationships, a fiancé. It's destabilizing. Imagine how I feel. I am. That's why I'm asking if you're sure. This might make things worse for both of us. Maren thought about the past 3 years, the careful numbness she'd cultivated, the archive work that had let her spend her days among the dead without having to face the living. None of it had been healing. It had been stasis, a holding pattern while she waited for something to give her permission to move forward or permission to give up entirely. Maybe this was that something. I'm sure, she said. Arden nodded slowly. Then I'll come back. Tomorrow? Tomorrow, same time. He stood, and she noticed again how thin he was, how the jacket hung slightly loose on his frame. Thank you, Maren. I know I can't imagine what this must be like for you. Can't you? She stood as well. You said you remember guilt. The feeling that you'd done something unforgivable. That's what this is like. Like I failed you somehow, and that's why you... She couldn't finish. You didn't fail me, Arden said quietly. Whatever happened, whatever I did, it wasn't your fault. How do you know? I don't. But I know guilt. I know what it feels like to carry it when you don't even remember what you're guilty of. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, especially not someone who... He gestured at the photograph of them together. Someone who loved that man enough to still be here, 3 years later, waiting. He left before she could respond, the door closing behind him with a soft click that felt far too final. Maren sat down at her desk and stared at the photograph of herself and Kier, happy and unaware of the fire that was coming to consume everything they'd built. Then she put her head in her hands and allowed herself to shake, just for a moment, before returning to the work of cataloging the dead. Only now the dead had come back to life. And somehow that was worse. Chapter 2, The Reconstruction. Arden Voss. Maren still couldn't think of him as Kier, not when he wore the name like borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit. Returned the next morning at precisely 9 o'clock. Punctuality, apparently, was another thing that survived amnesia. Kier had always been exactly on time, never early enough to seem eager, never late enough to seem disrespectful. A habit ingrained by years of social conditioning that his conscious mind had forgotten, but his body remembered. Maren had arrived an hour early, unable to sleep past 5, unable to stay in her apartment with only her thoughts and the medical records she'd read 17 times, trying to find some inconsistency, some proof that this was an elaborate con. She'd found nothing. The records were legitimate, the amnesia real. The man who'd walked out of her archive yesterday genuinely believed he was someone named Arden Voss, which meant Kier Ashford had set fire to his own life so thoroughly that even his memories had burned. She'd laid out more files this morning. Not the financial records or the impersonal family documents, but the personal things. Letters Kier had written to her during a month when he'd traveled for business. Photographs from trips they'd taken together, a weekend in the mountains, a week at the coast, a day trip to a vineyard where they'd gotten tipsy on samples and bought 6 bottles of wine they'd never opened. The engagement ring she'd returned to Kier's lawyer 6 months after the fire, unable to look at it anymore but unable to sell it either. The lawyer had archived it with the rest of the estate, and Maren had catalogued it with shaking hands, noting the inscription inside the band, Always K. She'd wondered, while cataloging, if Always had an expiration date. Apparently it did, 3 years, and 1 catastrophic fire. When Arden walked in, he was carrying 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled of cinnamon and sugar. I wasn't sure if you'd eaten, he said, setting 1 cup and the bag on her desk. The cafe on the corner makes good pastries. I got a variety, since I don't know what you like. The gesture was so unexpectedly thoughtful that Maren felt something crack in her chest. She looked at the coffee, prepared exactly the way she took it, with cream and 1 sugar, which meant he'd either asked the barista what she usually ordered, or he'd retained some muscle memory of how to care for her, even while forgetting why. How did you know how I take my coffee? She asked. Arden looked genuinely confused. I asked the barista what the archivist from the Historical Society usually orders. She said you come in most mornings. He paused. Did I do something wrong? No. It's, thank you. This is kind. He sat down, cradling his own cup. Black coffee, no sugar. Kier had taken his coffee the same way. Some things, Maren thought, live deeper than memory. They lived in preference and habit, in the small choices a body made before the mind could interfere. I didn't sleep well, Arden admitted. I kept thinking about the photographs, about the life in them. It felt like watching a movie about someone else, but knowing the actor had my face. It wasn't someone else, it was you. Was it? I've been thinking about that. About what makes a person continuous over time. Is it the body? The brain? Or is it the memories, the experiences that connect one moment to the next? He took a sip of coffee. If I don't remember loving you, am I still the person who did? Philosophically, I don't know. Practically, yes. You're still Kier Ashford. You still have his DNA, his fingerprints, his... She stopped, realizing how clinical she sounded. You're him. Whether you remember or not. That I'm guilty of whatever he did, the fire, the disappearance, leaving you. He said it matter-of-factly, but Maren heard the weight underneath. Even if I don't remember doing it, I'm responsible. I don't know if you set the fire. The records said it was arson. They did, but they never determined who started it. It could have been... Maren stopped, realizing she was trying to absolve him of something she didn't even know he'd done. 3 years of mourning, and her first instinct was still to protect him. It could have been me, Arden finished, and statistically it probably was. The owner of an estate burning down under suspicious circumstances, then disappearing. I don't need memory to know what that suggests. He was right, and Maren hated that he was right. She pulled the first file toward her, a collection of letters Kier had written during his business trip to Chicago 2 months before the fire. These are yours, she said, pushing them across the desk. You wrote them to me. Maybe they'll help. Arden opened the first letter carefully, as if it might disintegrate under his touch. Maren had memorized parts of them during the first year after the fire, when she'd needed proof that what they'd had was real, that she hadn't imagined the love in Kier's voice when he'd promised her always. The first letter was dated March 14th, 3 years and 7 months ago. It began, Maren, Chicago is gray and cold, and I miss you. The meetings are tedious. I keep thinking about the dinner we had before I left, how you laughed when I tried to pronounce the name of that French wine. I'm counting the days until I'm home. Arden read it slowly, then looked up. I sound lighter than I feel now. Is that strange to say? You were lighter then, before whatever happened. He moved to the next letter, and the next. They chronicled a week of business meetings, client dinners, hotel rooms, where Kier couldn't sleep because the bed was wrong, the pillows too soft, the absence of Maren too present. The letters grew more intimate as the week progressed. By the final one, Kier was writing about the future, the wedding they were planning, the renovations to the estate, children they might have someday. I want 3, he'd written. Is that too many? You'd be an incredible mother. Patient in ways I'm not. Kind in ways I forget to be. Sometimes I think you're too good for me. And then I think, no, I'll just have to become someone worthy of you. I'm working on it. I promise. Arden set down the letter with a carefulness that looked like pain. He sounds like someone who loved you very much. He did. And then I destroyed it all. Why would someone do that? I don't know. I've been trying to understand for 3 years. Arden was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letters spread across the desk like evidence at a crime scene. May I ask you something? Yes. In those last weeks before the fire, when you said I was different, how different? Maren thought back, trying to summon details she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. You were distracted. You'd start conversations and then trail off, like you'd forgotten what you were saying. You took a lot of phone calls you wouldn't explain. Your lawyer mostly, but also, I don't know who else. You'd leave the room to answer them. She paused. And you stopped sleeping well. I'd wake up at 2, 3 in the morning, and you'd be awake, staring at the ceiling. When I asked what was wrong, you'd say, work stress, or family business. I believed you. Did you have any reason not to? No, you'd never lied to me before, at least not that I knew of. The qualification tasted bitter. Now I wonder if I just didn't notice, if I was so busy being in love that I missed the signs of someone planning to disappear. Or maybe I hid it well. Arden leaned forward. The letters, they mentioned the estate renovations. Were they expensive? Very. The building was historic but aging. We'd planned to modernize the plumbing, update the electrical, restore some of the original features. The estimates were close to $2 million. And Kier had that kind of money? Maren hesitated. This felt like a betrayal, revealing Kier's financial troubles to a stranger, even if that stranger was Kier himself. But he was asking, and he deserved to know what he'd walked away from. He was supposed to, she said. The estate came with a trust, investments, assets. But I learned after the fire that a lot of it was complicated. There were debts I hadn't known about, business ventures that had failed. His father had been better at maintaining appearances than maintaining solvency, and Kier inherited both the estate and the financial mess. How much debt? $3 million, maybe more. The lawyer wasn't entirely forthcoming. Arden absorbed this. So the estate burns down, heavily insured, and the debts become someone else's problem. The insurance paid out to creditors. There wasn't much left. But there was enough to make me disappear. He said it flatly, as if he were discussing someone else's crime. And you, what did you get? Some savings accounts where I was listed as beneficiary. About $40,000 total. I didn't touch it for 2 years. When I finally did, I donated it to a fire safety charity. She didn't mention that she'd chosen the charity specifically because it worked with burn victims, that some part of her had needed to believe Kier had been hurt in the fire, even if he'd said it himself, that his suffering had been real, even if his love hadn't been. Arden pulled out his phone and made a note. He'd been doing that periodically, Maren noticed, building a case file on his own disappeared life. What else do you have? He asked. Maren pulled out a box of photographs. These are from the 2 years we were together. I thought, maybe if you see enough of them, something will trigger recognition. They went through the photographs methodically. Maren narrated each one, providing context that Arden received with the polite attention of someone touring a museum of someone else's life. Here was Kier and Maren at a charity gala, dressed formally, Kier's arm around her waist. Here they were hiking, both windblown and grinning at the summit. Here was Kier cooking dinner in Maren's apartment, looking over his shoulder at the camera with an expression of mock annoyance that didn't reach his eyes. You took most of these, Maren said. You liked photography. You said it was about capturing moments before they disappeared. Ironic, Arden murmured. What? Nothing. Just, I still like photography. I don't own a camera, but I notice light, composition. It's one of the few things I felt certain about when I woke up. I thought maybe I'd been a photographer before, in whatever life I'd forgotten. You were never a professional, just a hobbyist, but you were good. Maren pulled up a photo on her phone, not of them, but taken by Kier. It showed the estate at sunset, the stone walls golden in the fading light, shadows long across the lawn. You took this 2 months before the fire. You said it was your favorite shot of the house. Arden studied the image for a long time. It's a good composition, he said finally, but I don't remember taking it. He handed back her phone, and his hand brushed hers. He pulled away quickly, as if burned. Sorry, he said. It's fine. It's not. I can see what this is doing to you. Every time I don't remember something, it's like you're dying again, yes. Maren took a breath. But you're not dead. You're here, and that has to count for something, even if you don't remember why I want it to count. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Arden said, Tell me about the day we got engaged. Why? Because it's the kind of thing I should remember. And if I'm going to understand who I was, I need to know what I cared enough about to make permanent. Maren closed her eyes, summoning the memory. It came easily. She'd replayed it so many times in the first year after the fire that it had taken on a crystalline quality, every detail preserved. It was September, she said. We'd been together a year and a half. You took me to the estate. It was the first time I'd seen it. The gardens were overgrown, but beautiful, in a wild way. You walked me through the grounds, showing me everything, talking about the renovations you wanted to make. Then we were in the library, and you just stopped talking. You looked at me with this expression I couldn't read, and you said, "I know this house is a disaster. I know I come with complications. But I want to spend my life making both better, and I want you with me while I do it." "That's not the most romantic proposal I've ever heard," Arden observed. "It was perfect for who you were, honest, pragmatic. You weren't promising me a fairy tale. You were promising me work, and partnership, and the chance to build something together." Maren opened her eyes. I said yes immediately. "Did you have doubts?" The question surprised her. "No. Should I have?" "I don't know. I'm trying to understand why someone who proposed like that, someone who seemed to value honesty, would then lie so catastrophically." Arden's expression was troubled. "Unless I didn't see it as lying, unless I convinced myself that disappearing was, what, protecting you, freeing you? From what? From me, from whatever I'd become." He gestured at the letters, the photographs, the accumulated evidence of a life. "Look at this person. He's writing love letters and making promises and planning a future, and then something happens, something bad enough that burning down his life seems like the only option. What could that be?" Maren had spent 3 years asking herself the same question. "Debt," she said. "People kill themselves over debt. Maybe you saw the fire as a kind of death, a way to erase everything and start over. Then why not actually die? Why run?" "I don't know." "And why keep the newspaper clipping? Why hold on to evidence of what I'd done?" Arden picked up the plastic sleeve containing the yellowed newsprint. "If I wanted to disappear completely, I should have destroyed this. But I kept it. I was found with it in my pocket. Maybe you wanted to be found. Or maybe I wanted to remember what I'd done, to punish myself." He set down the clipping. "The book I was holding, the thriller about faking death. It doesn't end well for the protagonist. He creates a new identity, starts a new life, but the guilt destroys him. By the end, he turns himself in. Have you read it since?" 3 times. It feels important, but I don't know why." Maren's phone buzzed. A message from her supervisor. "Everything okay? You've been in the archive for 2 hours." She typed back a quick affirmative, then looked at Arden. "I need to do some actual work," she said, "but you can stay if you want. Keep looking through the files." "I don't want to intrude." "You're not. You're—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. What was he? Not quite a stranger, not quite Kier, not quite anything she had words for. "You're looking for answers. So am I. Maybe we can help each other." Arden nodded slowly. "All right. But Maren, I need you to understand something. Even if I find answers, even if I piece together what happened, I'm not going to suddenly become the man in these photographs. That's not how amnesia works. The memories might come back, or they might not. But either way, He gestured at himself. A motion that encompassed everything he'd become. "This is who I am now. Someone who works night shifts and lives alone and doesn't know how to connect with people because connection requires a shared past." "I know." "Do you?" "Because I see the way you look at me. Like you're waiting for me to wake up and remember and be him again. And I don't think that's going to happen." Maren felt the words like a physical blow, but she kept her voice steady. "Then what are we doing here?" "Trying to understand what happened. Trying to—" He stopped, struggling. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just lonely enough that even this, sitting with someone who knew me when I was someone else, feels like something." "Is that selfish?" "No, it's human. I'm not sure I qualify anymore. You brought me coffee and pastries. You apologized for not remembering me. You're worried about being selfish. That's all very human, Arden." He flinched slightly at the name. She noticed and filed it away. Another piece of evidence that he wasn't as comfortable with the identity of Arden Voss as he pretended to be. "Can I ask you something?" Maren said. "Of course. Do you want to remember? Honestly." Arden was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he finally said. "Part of me does. Part of me thinks remembering would give me back something essential that I'm missing. But another part, the part that has nightmares about fire and guilt, thinks maybe I forgot for a reason. Maybe my mind is protecting me from something I can't handle. Or maybe you're protecting yourself from having to take responsibility." The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but she didn't take them back. Arden didn't look offended. If anything, he looked relieved, as if he'd been waiting for her to say what they'd both been thinking. "You're right," he said. "If I never remember, I never have to face what I did. I can live as Arden Voss, this blank slate, and avoid the guilt that Kier Ashford deserves to feel." He met her eyes. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" "I think it's more complicated than that. I think trauma does strange things to the mind. But yes, part of me wonders if the amnesia is convenient." "It's not convenient. It's isolating and disorienting, and it makes every day feel like I'm acting a part one haven't learned properly." His voice was tight. "But I understand why you'd think that. Why you'd need to think that, even." "What does that mean?" "It means if I'm choosing not to remember, then you're not the woman whose fiancé loved her so little that he burned down his life to escape her. You're the woman whose fiancé had a tragic accident and lost himself. One of those is easier to live with." The observation was so accurate that Maren felt exposed, as if Arden had reached into her chest and pulled out a truth she'd been hiding from herself. He was right. She'd spent 3 years telling herself that Kier had died, because death was blameless. Death was an ending she didn't have to interpret or understand. But if Kier had chosen to leave, if he'd set the fire deliberately, staged his own disappearance, abandoned her without explanation, then she had to confront the possibility that she hadn't been enough, that the love she'd trusted had been a performance, or at least insufficient to outweigh whatever darkness had been growing in him. "I should get to work," she said, standing abruptly. Arden stood as well. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "No, you're right. You're absolutely right, and I hate that you're right." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I wanted you to be dead, because, at least then, I could mourn cleanly. This, you being here, being someone else, it's messier. I don't know how to mourn someone who's standing in front of me." "You don't have to mourn. You could just move on." "Could I, when the person I loved is here, looking at me with his face, speaking with his voice, but treating me like a stranger?" She shook her head. "I don't know how to move on from that." "Then, tell me what you need. Tell me how I can make this easier." "I need you to remember." "Or I need you to disappear again." "I need—" Her voice broke, and she stopped, refusing to cry. "I need this to be something I can understand. And right now, it isn't." Arden was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can leave. I can walk out of here and you'll never see me again. Would that be easier?" Maren thought about it. She thought about returning to her careful numbness, her archive work, her solitary routines. She thought about never having to see Kier's face again, never having to navigate the strange territory between stranger and beloved. "No," she said, "don't leave." "Then what do you want me to do?" "Keep coming back. Keep looking through the files. Keep—" She stopped, searching for the right words. "Keep trying. Even if you never remember, keep trying to understand. That's all I can ask." "I can do that," Arden said quietly. He left shortly after, taking the bag of pastries with him. Maren noticed he'd barely touched his own, and leaving the coffee cup on her desk like a small act of domesticity that hurt more than it should have. After he was gone, Maren sat alone in the archive, surrounded by the catalogued remnants of Kier Ashford's life, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd learned. Kier was alive. Kier didn't remember her. Kier had become someone named Arden who worked night shifts and lived alone and carried guilt he couldn't name. And somehow, impossibly, she was going to have to find a way to exist in the same world as this truth. She pulled out one of the letters he'd written, the one where he'd promised to become someone worthy of her, and read it until the words blurred. Then she carefully filed it away, returned to her cataloging work, and pretended that her hands weren't shaking. Outside, the autumn sun moved across the sky, marking time that meant nothing and everything. Chapter 3: The Spaces Between. Arden came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. It became a rhythm. 9 o'clock, coffee and pastries, hours spent sifting through the accumulated debris of Kier Ashford's life, while Maren worked at her desk, pretending not to watch him. Pretending his presence wasn't rewiring something fundamental in her carefully constructed isolation. By the end of the first week, she'd stopped pretending to work. Instead, she sat across from him and narrated the life he'd forgotten, answering questions he asked with increasing frequency, filling in gaps that the documents couldn't bridge. "What did I do for work?" he asked on the fourth day, holding a business card that identified Kier Ashford as a consultant for estate management. "You advised families on preserving historic properties, how to maintain them, modernize them without destroying their character, navigate the legal complications of inherited estates." Maren paused. "You were good at it. People trusted you. Was it profitable?" "Enough. It wasn't the money that was the problem. It was your father's debts. He'd taken out loans against the estate, made investments that failed. You inherited all of it, along with the property." Arden made another note on his phone. He'd been building a timeline, cross-referencing dates and events, trying to construct a narrative from fragments. Maren had seen him working on it during their lunch breaks. He'd started taking those with her, bringing sandwiches from the cafe, eating in companionable silence, or answering her questions about his life as Arden Voss. That life, she'd learned, was sparse to the point of asceticism. He worked from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, cleaning hospital floors, emptying waste bins, sanitizing surfaces. He slept during the day in his single room, which contained a bed, a chair, a hot plate, and nothing decorative except a photograph he'd taken of the beach where he'd been found. "I don't know why I keep it," he'd said. "It's not a happy memory. But it's the only origin story I have." He had no hobbies except walking and photography, which he practiced with his phone camera since he couldn't afford proper equipment. He read constantly. Thrillers mostly, the kind with protagonists who lived double lives or ran from their pasts. "I used to think I was looking for clues," he'd admitted. "Now I think I just like stories about people who are lost. It makes me feel less alone." He didn't date. "How could I?" he'd said when Maren asked. "I can't tell anyone who I am because I don't know. And I can't build something with someone when half of me might not even exist." The loneliness in that admission had stayed with Maren for days. On the 5th day, she brought him to the ruins of the estate. They drove in her car. Arden didn't own one, took buses everywhere, said he didn't trust himself behind a wheel when he couldn't remember learning to drive. The estate was 40 minutes outside of town, down a winding road that Maren had once driven every weekend, back when visiting Kier had been the axis around which her life turned. The land had been sold to pay debts, but the new owners hadn't done anything with it yet. The ruins remained, stone walls rising from overgrown grass, empty window frames staring like the sockets of a skull. Maren parked at the edge of the property and killed the engine. "This is it," she said. Arden stared through the windshield at the remains of his former life. His expression was unreadable. "Do you want to get out?" Maren asked. "I don't know." They sat in silence for several minutes. Then Arden opened his door and stepped out, and Maren followed. The autumn air was cool, carrying the smell of dying leaves and damp earth. They walked toward the ruins slowly, neither speaking. Maren watched Arden's face for any sign of recognition, but there was only careful observation, the same expression he wore when reviewing documents. "The library was there," Maren said, pointing to a section of wall that still stood, blackened by smoke. That's where you proposed." Arden walked to the wall, placed his hand on the stone. "I don't remember it." "I know, but I feel something, not memory. Just," he struggled for the word, "wait, like this place matters, even if I don't know why." They explored the grounds together. Maren showed him where the gardens had been, where they'd planned to host the wedding reception, where Kier's study had stood, the room where he'd likely been when the fire started, where the investigation had found the highest concentration of accelerant. "This is where I was," Arden said, standing in the footprint of the destroyed study, "when it started." "Probably. Was anyone else here that night?" "Not that we know of. The staff had left hours earlier. I'd gone home to change. You were supposed to be alone." Arden knelt down, ran his fingers through the ash-mixed soil. "So if I set the fire, I was trying to kill myself along with everything else." "Or you were trying to make it look that way. Which is worse, actually wanting to die, or being calculating enough to stage it?" Maren didn't have an answer. Both options were terrible in different ways. Both suggested a Kier she hadn't known, or hadn't wanted to see. Arden stood, brushed off his hands. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "In those last weeks, did I seem suicidal?" The question landed like a physical blow. Maren thought back, searching for signs she might have missed. Had Kier been saying goodbye without her noticing? Had there been a finality to his touches, his words, his promises? "No," she said finally. "You seemed stressed, distracted, but not like you wanted to die. You were still making plans, still talking about the future. Maybe that's what people do. Make plans to convince themselves and everyone else that they're going to be around to see them through. Or maybe you weren't suicidal. Maybe you just wanted to disappear." "Then I did a thorough job of it." Arden looked around at the ruins. "Burned everything, changed my name, lost my memory. If I was trying to erase Kier Ashford, I succeeded." There was something in his voice, not quite satisfaction, but a grim recognition of a job well done. It made Maren wonder if some part of him, deep down, was relieved to be Arden instead of Kier. If the amnesia, whether organic or psychogenic, was a mercy he'd granted himself. "Do you want to be him again?" she asked. "If you could remember everything, would you want to?" Arden was quiet for a long time, staring at the blackened walls. "I don't know if I get to want that. He did something. I did something unforgivable. And part of me thinks I should have to face it, should have to remember and live with the guilt. But another part is grateful I don't have to. Is that cowardice? Maybe. Or maybe it's self-preservation. What's the difference?" Maren thought about her own survival mechanisms, the numbness she'd cultivated, the archive work that kept her focused on other people's losses instead of her own. "I'm not sure there is one." They stayed at the ruins for another hour, walking the perimeter, sitting on the stone foundation where the front steps had been. Arden took photographs with his phone, not of the ruins themselves, but of details. A wildflower growing through a crack in the stone. The way light fell through an empty window frame. The contrast between destruction and persistence. "I do this at the hospital too," he said, showing Maren the photos. "Find small, beautiful things in places that are supposed to be about loss. I don't know if it's hope or delusion. Maybe it's both." On the drive back, Arden was quiet, processing. Maren let the silence settle between them, no longer feeling the need to fill it. They'd developed an ease with each other over the past week, a rhythm of conversation and quiet that felt almost comfortable. Almost like the relationship she'd had with Kier, except emptied of history and intimacy and any expectation beyond the present moment. "Thank you for bringing me here," Arden said as they reached the outskirts of town. "Did it help?" "I don't know, but I feel like I understand something better, about how someone could want to burn it all down." He looked out the window. "It's a lot to carry. That estate, those debts, the expectations of being the last of a family line. I can see how it could become suffocating. You never told me you felt suffocated." "Maybe I didn't know how, or maybe I thought I could handle it alone." He turned to look at her. "Did I let you in?" When we were together, did I let you see the parts of me that were struggling? Maren thought about it honestly. Sometimes. But there were walls. Things you kept private. I thought it was just how you were raised. Old family, old money, stiff upper lip and all that. I didn't realize you were drowning. And if you had, would you have stayed? Yes, she said it without hesitation. I would have helped you carry it. That's what partnership means. Or I would have pulled you under with me. The observation hung in the air between them, impossible to dispute. Maybe Kier had known that. Maybe leaving, burning it all down, had been his way of protecting her from his own collapse. It didn't make the abandonment hurt less, but it complicated the narrative Maren had been telling herself about being unloved, unwanted. She dropped Arden off at his building, a narrow structure wedged between a dry cleaner and a convenience store, paint peeling, stairs listing slightly to the left. He got out, then leaned back in through the open door. Same time tomorrow? He asked. Actually, I was thinking, tomorrow's Saturday. The archive is closed, but if you wanted to, she stopped, unsure what she was offering. There are more places we used to go together, if you want to see them. Arden studied her face. Why? Because maybe the documents aren't enough. Maybe you need to stand in the places where Kier existed, see if anything resonates. Or maybe you need to show me, to prove to yourself that he was real, that what you had was real. He was right, but Maren didn't care. Does it matter? Either way, you get information. I get. She stopped. What do you get? I don't know yet, but I'm tired of being alone with this. Even if you don't remember, at least you're here. You're evidence that I'm not making it all up. Arden's expression softened. Okay. Tomorrow. Where should I meet you? They arranged a time and place. The cafe where they'd had their first date, if it was still open. Arden said he'd check, then disappeared into his building, and Maren drove home feeling something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Anticipation. It frightened her. The cafe was still there, though under new ownership. The interior had been redecorated, the warm browns and golds that Maren remembered replaced with industrial grays and minimalist fixtures. But the corner table, where she and Kier had sat for 3 hours, talking until the staff started stacking chairs around them, was still there. She arrived early and claimed it, ordering coffee she didn't drink, watching the door. When Arden walked in, he was wearing different clothes than usual. Dark jeans, a gray sweater that made his eyes look more green than gray. He'd shaved, cut his hair slightly. The changes were subtle, but significant. He looked less like someone trying to disappear, and more like someone attempting to be present. You look nice, Maren said when he sat down. I thought I should make an effort. He gestured at himself awkwardly. Is it too much? No, it's good. They ordered food. Maren asked for the same sandwich Kier used to get, watching to see if Arden would order it too. He didn't. He chose something different. A salad with grilled chicken, nothing that connected to his past self. So this is where it started, he said, looking around the renovated space. This is where we met. You were already here when I arrived. You'd claimed the best table and ordered coffee for both of us. You'd asked the mutual friend who'd arranged the introduction what I liked. I thought it was presumptuous. You thought it was efficient. Who was right? Both of us. That was the theme of our relationship. We were both right, just about different things. Arden smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. For a moment, she could see Kier in him, not as a ghost, but as a possibility. What did we talk about? He asked. Books, initially. I'd just finished authenticating a collection of first editions for an estate sale. You asked intelligent questions, not showing off, genuinely curious. Then we talked about preservation, about the ethics of keeping versus selling family heirlooms, about whether the past should be maintained or released. Maren paused. You said something that stuck with me. You said, the past is only valuable if it teaches us how to build a better future. Otherwise, it's just dead weight. Ironic, given that I'm now buried under a past I can't remember. Or maybe prophetic. Maybe you burned it down because you couldn't figure out how to build anything better with it. Their food arrived. They ate slowly, talking in the spaces between bites. Arden asked questions. What movies they'd watched together, what music Kier had liked, whether he'd been religious, political, athletic. Maren answered as honestly as she could, trying to give him a full picture rather than a sanitized version. You could be selfish, she said at one point. Not often, but sometimes you'd make decisions without consulting me because you assumed you knew what was best. It frustrated me. We fought about it a few times. Did I apologize? Eventually. You weren't good at admitting you were wrong initially, but you'd come around, usually with some grand gesture, flowers, a handwritten note, cooking dinner even though you hated cooking. Did it work, the gestures? Usually. I was a soft touch where you were concerned. Was that good or bad? Maren considered. Both. It meant I forgave you when maybe I should have held firmer boundaries. But it also meant we didn't let resentment build. We moved past things. After lunch, they walked. Maren took him to the park where they'd had picnics, the bookstore where they'd browsed on rainy Saturdays, the art gallery where Kier had tried to explain modern painting to her, and she'd pretended to understand. Each location triggered stories, small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt precious in their accumulated weight. We came here the week before the fire, Maren said, standing outside a wine bar that had closed since. You were quiet that night. I asked what was wrong, and you said you were thinking about your father, about how he'd handled the estate, the choices he'd made. You said you didn't want to make the same mistakes. What mistakes? You didn't specify, but I got the sense you meant living for appearances, maintaining a facade of success while everything crumbled underneath. Arden was quiet, processing. They kept walking, ending up at the waterfront as the afternoon light began to golden. They sat on a bench overlooking the harbor, watching boats drift past. I work near water, Arden said. The hospital is only a few blocks from the beach. I walk there sometimes after my shift, before I go home to sleep. It's the only place where I feel not calm exactly, but less fragmented. Kier loved the ocean. We talked about getting a house near the coast someday, after the estate was settled. That won't happen now. No. They sat in silence as the sun lowered. Maren became aware of how close they were sitting. Not touching, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could count the breaths he took. It felt both familiar and strange, this proximity to a body she'd once known intimately but now belonged to someone else. Can I tell you something? Arden said quietly. Yes. This scares me, not the memories or the past. I've made peace with not remembering. But this, sitting with you, talking. Starting to care about whether I'm giving you what you need. He turned to look at her. I came to the archive looking for information. But now I'm here, and I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Neither do I. Does that bother you? Maren thought about it. A week ago, the uncertainty would have been unbearable. But now, sitting beside this man who was and wasn't Kier, she found the not knowing almost bearable. Not comfortable, but possible. No, she said, it doesn't bother me. It's just what this is. And what is this? I don't know. Two people trying to understand something that might not have an explanation. Two people who are lonely enough that even this strange half-connection feels like something worth having. She looked at him. Is that enough for you? I don't know if I get to ask for more. Neither do I. The admission hung between them, honest and raw. Then Arden did something unexpected. He reached over and took her hand, held it gently, as if it were something fragile that might break under too much pressure. I don't remember you, he said, but I think I could care about you. The you that exists now, not the you that Kier loved. Is that allowed? Maren felt her throat tighten. I don't know what's allowed. Then let's just exist in this moment, not worry about what it means or where it's going. Just be two people sitting by the water, holding hands, trying to figure out how to be less alone. I can do that, Maren whispered. They sat until the sun set completely, until the harbor lights blinked on, and the temperature dropped enough that Maren shivered. Arden offered her his jacket, an automatic gesture that made her wonder how much of Kier's consideration had survived in muscle memory. She accepted it, grateful for the warmth and for the small kindness that felt too natural to be entirely learned. When he walked her back to her car, neither of them mentioned the next day or the day after. They simply said good night, and Arden waited until she'd driven away before turning toward the bus stop that would take him back to his small room above the laundromat. Maren drove home with his jacket still around her shoulders, smelling faintly of soap and something else, something that might have been Kier's cologne, or might have been her imagination filling in details that weren't there. She didn't take it off until she was inside her apartment, and even then, she hung it carefully on a chair where she could see it. That night, for the first time in 3 years, she didn't dream about fire. She dreamed about water instead, dark and cold and infinite, but not drowning, just floating, held by something she couldn't see but could feel supporting her, keeping her head above the surface. When she woke, she didn't analyze it. She simply got dressed and went about her day, carrying the dream like a secret she wasn't ready to share. The spaces between them were starting to fill with something. She didn't know what yet, but it felt not like hope exactly, more like possibility. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 4, The Fault Lines. The routine continued for another week. Arden came to the archive during the day now. His night shifts temporarily adjusted so he could spend afternoons with Maren, sifting through Kier's life like archaeologists excavating a civilization that had collapsed suddenly, without warning. But something had shifted after the day at the waterfront. The boundaries between archivist and subject, between stranger and known, had become permeable. They touched more, casual brushes of hands when passing documents, shoulders bumping when they sat close to review photographs together. Maren caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, studying the way he held a pen, the way he tilted his head when concentrating, trying to separate Kier's gestures from Arden's, and finding the line increasingly difficult to locate. On Tuesday, Arden brought lunch, not from the cafe, but homemade. Sandwiches he'd made in his single room's inadequate kitchen, wrapped carefully in paper, presented with an awkwardness that suggested this was new territory for him. "I thought, you've been buying all week. It seemed fair to reciprocate," he said, setting them on her desk. Maren unwrapped hers. Turkey and avocado, her favorite. "How did you know what I like?" "You've ordered it 3 times at the cafe. I assumed it wasn't coincidence." He hesitated. Is that strange? That I noticed." "No, it's observant." She took a bite. The sandwich was good, better than good. The bread was from the bakery downtown, the expensive kind. The avocado was perfectly ripe. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to. You've been generous with your time, with everything. I wanted to give something back." They ate in comfortable silence, and Maren felt something dangerous unfurling in her chest. This wasn't grief anymore. This wasn't the desperate hope that Arden would suddenly remember and become Kier again. This was something newer, more fragile. An attraction to the man sitting across from her, not the ghost he'd been. After lunch, they returned to the files. Arden had been working through financial records, trying to map out the months before the fire. He'd created a spreadsheet, color-coded, cross-referenced with dates from Maren's timeline. The picture it painted was damning. "Look at this," he said, turning his laptop toward her. 3 months before the fire, Kier started liquidating assets. Small things at first. Artwork, jewelry, a vintage car. Then, larger items. He closed investment accounts, cashed out bonds. The amounts aren't huge individually, but collectively. He pointed to a sum at the bottom of the column. Roughly $200,000, converted to cash over 3 months. Where did it go? That's what I can't figure out. It wasn't used to pay down debts. Those were all still outstanding when the fire happened. It didn't go into any account I can find. It just disappeared. Maren stared at the numbers, feeling sick. He was planning it, the disappearance. He was setting up a new life. It looks that way, and if he withdrew this much in cash, he could have lived modestly for years without leaving a paper trail. Arden's expression was troubled. The question is, why? The debts were bad, but not insurmountable. He could have declared bankruptcy, started over legitimately. Why stage his death? Maybe bankruptcy wasn't an option. Maybe he'd done something. Maren stopped, not wanting to finish the thought. Illegal? Arden finished for her. I've been wondering that, too. What if the debts weren't just debts? What if he'd borrowed from the wrong people, made promises he couldn't keep? Kier wasn't. He wouldn't. But even as she said it, Maren realized she didn't know. She'd loved Kier, but had she known him? Or had she known a carefully curated version, the parts he'd chosen to show her? Arden must have seen something in her face, because he closed the laptop. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be theorizing about worst-case scenarios. No, you should. We need to understand what happened. Maren took a breath. Keep digging. Find out where the money went. Maybe there's a bank account somewhere, a storage unit, something that will explain this. And if the explanation is that that I was involved in something criminal, then we'll deal with it. Maren's voice was steadier than she felt. But I need to know. Whatever the truth is, it's better than the not knowing. Arden nodded, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. He was afraid of what they'd find. She was too. On Thursday, the fault lines became fissures. Arden had been quiet all morning, barely speaking, focused intensely on his laptop. When Maren asked if he was all right, he gave a non-committal answer and returned to his work. She let him be, sensing he was processing something difficult. At noon, he stood abruptly. I need to show you something, but not here. They drove to the beach where Arden had been found 3 years ago. It was a 40-minute drive, spent mostly in silence. Arden stared out the window, his hands restless in his lap. When they arrived, he got out and walked toward the water without waiting for her. Maren followed, her heart hammering. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air between them, a charge like the atmosphere before a storm. They reached the shore, a stretch of gray sand and darker rocks, waves rolling in with mechanical regularity. Arden stood at the water's edge, letting the foam wash over his shoes. I remembered something, he said without preamble. Not a full memory, just a flash. But it's the first real memory I've had since waking up in the hospital. Maren's breath caught. What did you remember? This beach, being here. It was night, very late, or very early. I was standing exactly here, and I was thinking. He stopped, his voice roughening. I was thinking that I could walk into the water and just keep walking, that it would be easier than trying to live with what I'd done. The words landed like stones. Maren felt them sink into her chest, heavy and cold. But you didn't, she said quietly. No, I didn't. Because I couldn't remember what I'd done, and some part of me, the survival instinct, or cowardice, or whatever, that part said I couldn't end it without knowing, that I at least owed myself the truth before I made that choice. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were desolate. So I walked away from the water, and I collapsed maybe a mile down the beach. And someone found me and called an ambulance, and I woke up to a life I didn't recognize. Arden, that's not the point. He spoke over her, urgent now. The point is what I felt, standing here, the guilt. It was crushing, physical. I could barely breathe under the weight of it, and I don't know what caused it, but I know it was real. I know Kier did something unforgivable. You don't know that. Guilt isn't always proportionate to the crime. Sometimes we feel guilty for things that aren't our fault. Don't, his voice was sharp, don't make excuses for me. I know what you're doing, trying to preserve some version of Kier that's worth loving. But what if there isn't one? What if the man you loved was a lie from the beginning? That's not true. How do you know? You said yourself there were walls, things he kept from you. What if those walls were hiding someone who was capable of... He stopped, looking back at the water. I've been digging into the financial records, into everything, and I found something. Marin's stomach dropped. What? A safety deposit box, rented 6 weeks before the fire, at a bank 2 towns over. Listed under a false name, but the signature, I compared it to Kier's. It's a match. How did you find this? A receipt, buried in the back of a ledger like he'd forgotten it was there. Or maybe he wanted it found eventually. Arden pulled out his phone, showed her a photo of a thin paper slip. I called the bank. The box is still there, still being paid for. There was enough prepaid rent to cover years. What's in it? I don't know. I don't have the key. I don't have the legal right to access it, since it's not under my current name. He pocketed his phone. But I could find a way. Break in, forge documents, something, if you want me to. Marin looked at the receipt, at the false name, Michael Brennan, nobody they knew, and felt the foundation of everything she'd believed begin to crack. Yes, she said, find a way. I need to know what's in there. They drove back in heavier silence. When they reached the archive, Arden didn't get out immediately. Marin, he said, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that what's in that box will change everything, that it might make it impossible for you to... He stopped. To what? To look at me without seeing someone you should despise. I could never despise you. You don't know that. You don't know what I might have done. Neither do you. Exactly, he turned to her. And that's what terrifies me, not knowing what I'm capable of, what I've already done. His hand found hers, gripped it tightly. If you want to stop this now, walk away before we find out. I'd understand. I'd rather you remember Kier the way he was in those early photographs than know him as whatever he became. Marin looked at their joined hands, at the way his fingers threaded through hers with a familiarity that transcended memory. I can't walk away, she said. I've spent 3 years not knowing. I can't go back to that. Even if the truth destroys the love you had for him? Even then. Arden nodded slowly. All right, I'll get into the box. It might take a few days. I need to figure out the logistics. But I'll do it. And then? Then we'll know. And we'll deal with whatever comes after. He left, and Marin sat alone in her car, staring at the archive building where she'd spent 3 years cataloging the dead. She'd thought of that work as penance, a way of honoring Kier's memory by caring for other people's lost loved ones. But maybe it had just been avoidance, a way of focusing on other people's grief so she didn't have to examine her own. Now she had no choice. The grief was alive again, mutating into something more complex. She was mourning Kier while beginning to care for Arden, while simultaneously uncovering evidence that both of them might be built on lies. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation she'd had with Kier in those final weeks, looking for clues she'd missed, warnings she'd ignored. Had he been saying goodbye? Had she been too in love to see it? At 2 a.m, her phone buzzed. A text from Arden. Can't sleep either. Keep thinking about what might be in that box, hoping it's nothing terrible, expecting it's worse than we can imagine. She typed back, whatever it is, we'll face it together. His response came quickly, that might be more than I deserve. Maybe, but it's what I'm offering anyway. A long pause. Then, thank you for not giving up on this. On me. I don't know how to give up on you. I tried for 3 years. It didn't work. Another pause, longer this time. When his response came, it made her chest ache. I think I'm starting to care about you, not as an echo of what Kier felt, as something new. Is that wrong? Marin stared at the message for a full minute before responding. No, it's not wrong. I'm starting to care about you too. The you that exists now. It's terrifying. Why terrifying? Because I don't know who you are yet. You might be someone I can't love. Or worse, you might be someone I can love, and then you'll disappear again. I won't disappear. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I won't choose to. Whatever we find in that box, whatever I learn about who I was, I won't run. Not from you. Marin wanted to believe him. She wanted it with an intensity that frightened her. But promises were fragile things, easily broken by truths that proved too heavy to carry. "Get some sleep," she typed. "Tomorrow we start figuring out how to open Pandora's box. And if what we find destroys us, then at least we'll know." She set down her phone and closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, she thought about that safety deposit box, sitting in a bank 2 towns over, containing secrets that Kier had hidden so carefully. Secrets worth creating a false identity for, worth keeping, even as he burned down everything else. What could be so terrible that death seemed preferable to exposure? And more importantly, was she ready to know? Friday morning, Arden appeared at the archive with dark circles under his eyes and a plan. "I found a lawyer," he said, setting down coffee he'd brought for both of them. "Someone who specializes in identity law, cases where people need to reclaim assets from previous identities. I explained the situation, amnesia, trying to access a box that might belong to me. He thinks he can help." "How long will it take?" "A few weeks for the legal approach. Or," he hesitated, "there's another option. The bank where the box is located. It's small, old-fashioned. They use physical keys, not biometric security. If I had the key, I could just walk in." "Do you have it?" "No. But I've been thinking about where Kier might have hidden it. Somewhere safe, but accessible. Somewhere he could retrieve it if needed." Arden pulled out his phone, showed her photos he'd taken of the financial records. "Look at this. 2 days before the fire, he made a withdrawal from a bank in the city. Not cash, just accessed his safety deposit box there. Then nothing, no more banking activity." "You think he moved the key from one box to another? Or he took it with him, had it on him when whatever happened, happened?" Arden's voice was strained. "When I was found, I had almost nothing. The book, the newspaper clipping, the clothes I was wearing. If the key was on me, the hospital would have logged it with my personal effects." "Did they?" "I don't know. I never asked. When I woke up, I was so focused on figuring out who I was that I didn't care about the physical items. But the hospital keeps those records. We could call, find out what else was found with me." They called. Arden spoke to someone in the hospital's patient records department, explaining that he needed an inventory of his personal effects from 3 years ago. There was a long hold. Music played, something classical and inappropriately cheerful. Marin watched Arden's face as he waited, saw the tension in his jaw, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched. Finally, someone came back on the line. Arden listened, asked a few clarifying questions, then thanked them and hung up. "There was a key," he said quietly. "Small brass key, no identifying marks. They still have it in storage. I can pick it up any time." Marin felt her heartbeat accelerate. "So we can open the box." "As soon as I retrieve the key. They're open until 5 today. I could go now, come back, and we could drive to the bank tomorrow morning." "Do it." Arden stood, then paused. "Are you sure? Once we open that box, we can't unknow what's inside." "I'm sure." He left. Marin tried to work. There was a new collection that needed cataloging, documents from a recently deceased professor. But she couldn't focus. Her mind kept circling back to that safety deposit box, to the secrets Kier had hidden there. Money? Documents? Evidence of crimes? Or something more personal, more devastating? 3 hours later, Arden returned. He was holding a small plastic bag containing a single brass key. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Marin confirmed. That night, neither of them slept. Marin knew because Arden texted her at midnight, 1:33 a.m., just checking in, just acknowledging the shared insomnia. She responded each time, grateful not to be alone with her spiraling thoughts. At 4, he called instead of texting. "I need to say something," he said when she answered. His voice was rough, exhausted. "Before we open that box, in case what's inside changes everything." "Okay. I'm grateful, for these past few weeks, for you giving me a chance to understand who I was, even though it must have been painful. For sitting with me while I tried to piece together a life I don't remember." He paused. and for starting to see me as someone separate from Kier. That matters more than I can articulate. Arden, let me finish. Whatever we find tomorrow, whatever Kier did, I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the first time since I woke up 3 years ago that I've felt like a real person. Not just a blank slate or a collection of symptoms. A person with the potential for connection, for meaning. His voice caught. So thank you for giving me that. Maren's eyes burned. You're welcome. And Arden? Yeah? Whatever we find, you're not alone in it. I meant what I said. We face it together. Even if it's unforgivable? Even then. They stayed on the phone for another hour, not talking much, just breathing in tandem, drawing comfort from the shared vigil. When they finally said goodnight, or good morning since dawn was approaching, Maren felt steadier. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. And neither would he. Chapter 5, The Unraveling. The bank was a squat brick building on a street that had seen better decades, wedged between a pawn shop and a discount furniture store. The kind of place that survived on inertia rather than innovation, serving customers who valued discretion over convenience. Maren parked across the street and killed the engine, and for a long moment neither she nor Arden moved. We could leave, Arden said quietly. Drive away. Pretend we never found the receipt. Could we? No. He looked at the key in his palm, the brass dull with age. But it was worth offering. They crossed the street together. Inside, the bank smelled of old paper and furniture polish. A single teller worked behind bulletproof glass, and a bored security guard sat near the door, scrolling through his phone. Arden approached the teller with the key and the false name, Michael Brennan, and explained he needed to access his safety deposit box. The teller, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, examined the key. Box 247. I'll need to see identification. Arden had prepared for this. He'd brought his hospital records, his current ID as Arden Voss, and a notarized letter from his lawyer explaining the situation. Amnesia, attempting to reclaim assets, legally complex. The teller read everything, with painstaking slowness, while Maren stood beside Arden, her hands clenched so tight, her nails cut crescents into her palms. Finally, the teller sighed. This is highly irregular. I understand, but as the letter explains, I'll need to call my manager. She disappeared into a back office, leaving them standing at the counter. The security guard glanced up from his phone, mildly interested now. What if they say no? Maren whispered. Then we find another way. Break in. Bribe someone. I don't care. Arden's voice was low and fierce. We've come too far to stop now. 10 minutes passed. 15. Finally, the teller returned with a man in a suit who looked simultaneously important and deeply inconvenienced. Mr. Voss, the manager said, I've reviewed your documentation. While this is an unusual situation, our policy does allow for access in cases of verified identity recovery. However, he held up a hand before Arden could speak. I need to verify that you are indeed the person who rented this box. Do you have any distinguishing marks? Scars, birthmarks, anything that might have been noted when the box was initially rented? Arden's hand went to the scar on his jaw. This is new, from whatever happened 3 years ago. But, he stopped, thinking, there's a birthmark on my left shoulder blade, shaped like a comma. The manager consulted a file. That matches our records. Mr. Brennan noted it on his rental agreement. He set down the file. All right, I'll allow access, but I need to supervise. Bank policy for disputed boxes. That's fine. They were led down a narrow hallway to a room lined with metal boxes. The manager used a master key along with Arden's key to open box 247. He withdrew a long metal container, set it on a table in the center of the room. I'll be right outside, the manager said. Take your time. The door closed. Arden and Maren stood on opposite sides of the table staring at the box. It was perhaps 18 inches long, 6 inches deep, unremarkable except for what it represented. Kier's secrets, preserved in metal and darkness. Do you want me to open it? Marin asked. No, I should. Arden reached for the lid, then stopped. But stay close, please. I'm not going anywhere. He lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of documents, a manila envelope, and a small leather journal. Arden removed the journal first, opened it to the first page. Kier's handwriting filled the lines, precise, controlled, the same script Marin had seen on letters and documents. Arden read aloud, his voice shaking slightly. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. Or maybe it went exactly as planned, and I'm dead. Actually dead, not the staged version. Either way, I owe an explanation to whoever finds this. Probably Marin, if she's looking. Probably the authorities, if someone reported me missing. So here it is. The truth, I couldn't tell anyone while I was alive. He paused, swallowed hard, then continued. I stole money, not from my family. That money was already gone, squandered by my father on bad investments and worse decisions. I stole from clients, people who trusted me to manage their estates, to preserve their family legacies. Over 3 years, I embezzled nearly $2 million. Small amounts at first, then larger as I got desperate, as my father's debts came due, and I realized I couldn't pay them legitimately. Marin felt the room tilt. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Arden kept reading, mechanical now, as if distancing himself from the words. I told myself I'd pay it back, that I just needed time, needed to make the right investments, but that's a lie. I knew I was stealing. I knew it would eventually be discovered. And when one of my clients started asking questions, started requesting audits, I panicked. I had maybe 6 months before everything unraveled. So I made a plan. He turned the page. The fire would cover my tracks, destroy the records I kept at the estate, make it look like everything was lost. I'd withdraw what I could in cash, store it somewhere safe, then disappear. Start over with a new name, a new life. Leave behind the debts, the impending criminal charges, the disgrace. Leave behind Marin. Arden's voice broke on her name. He stopped reading, his hands trembling. Keep going, Marin said, though her own voice was barely a whisper. That's the part one can't justify, the part that makes me a coward beyond the fraud. I loved Marin. I loved her more than I've loved anything, or anyone. But I couldn't face her, knowing what I'd done. Couldn't watch her realize the man she was going to marry was a thief and a liar. So I decided it would be easier for both of us if I just stopped existing. Let her mourn someone who never really was, rather than hate the person I'd actually become. Arden set down the journal, stared at it like it was something toxic. There's more, Marin said, though she didn't want there to be more, didn't want any of this to be real. Do you want me to read it? Yes. He picked up the journal again, flipped through pages. It's dated, entries over 6 months. He was planning everything. The withdrawals, the false identity, even the fire. He stopped at an entry near the end. This is from 2 days before it happened. I saw Marin today. We talked about the wedding, about the flowers she wanted, about honeymoon destinations. She was happy, excited, and I sat there, smiling, pretending I'd be there for any of it, knowing I was going to destroy her. I'm writing this down because I need to remember, I need whoever finds this to know, that I understood what I was doing. This wasn't a moment of madness or a desperate mistake. I chose this. I chose to hurt her rather than face the consequences of my own actions. That makes me irredeemable. Arden closed the journal, set it down carefully. The last entry is the day of the fire. He wrote it that morning, before everything. What does it say? Are you sure? Read it. Arden opened to the final page. His voice was hollow. Tonight, I burn it all down. The estate, the records, the life I built on lies. I've already moved the money. It's in accounts under the Brennan name, untraceable. I've packed a bag with clothes, documents, cash. I'll set the fire around midnight, when the staff is gone and Marin is home. I'll make sure it looks accidental. A gas leak, faulty wiring, something plausible. Then I'll drive to the coast and disappear. By the time anyone realizes I'm missing, I'll be someone else. And Maren will be free to mourn and move on. Free to find someone who deserves her, someone who isn't me. The last line was written in a different hand, shakier. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but I'm too much of a coward to do anything else. Silence filled the room like water, drowning them both. Maren couldn't speak, couldn't breathe properly. The man she'd loved, the man she'd mourned, had been a thief. A liar. Someone who'd stolen from people who'd trusted him, then burned down his life rather than face justice. And he'd left her, not because he was dead, not because of some uncontrollable tragedy, but because he'd chosen to, because her pain was preferable to his shame. Maren, Arden's voice cut through the roaring in her ears. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say. Don't, the word came out sharp. Don't apologize for something he did. But I'm him, I did this. No, you're not him anymore. You're someone who can barely afford to eat, who cleans hospital floors at night, who lives in a single room. You're not the person who wrote this. She gestured at the journal, unable to touch it. I have his face, his voice, his... Arden stopped, looking down at his hands as if they were foreign objects. The money. It says he moved it to accounts under the Brennan name. If that's true, then legally. Don't, Maren's voice rose. Don't even think about it. I have to. If there's stolen money in accounts I can access, I have a legal obligation to return it, to make restitution. With what identity? Arden Voss? Kier Ashford? Michael Brennan? You don't exist in any way that would hold up in court. Then I'll figure it out. I'll find the lawyer again, explain everything. There has to be a way to fix this, at least partially. Maren looked at him, this man who'd woken up 3 years ago with no memory and built a life of almost monastic poverty, who'd come looking for answers and found damnation instead, and felt something crack open in her chest. You want to fix it, she said, even though you don't remember doing it, even though the guilt isn't yours in any way that matters. It is mine. These are my hands, my name, even if I don't use it. My responsibility. He looked at her with something like desperation. I can't just walk away knowing this money exists, knowing people were hurt. Even if I don't remember them, they deserve. What about what you deserve? The question stopped him. He stared at her, uncomprehending. You've been punishing yourself for 3 years, Maren continued, living in poverty, isolation, working a job that keeps you separate from everyone. You've been carrying guilt you couldn't even name. And now you want to take on more? To destroy the small life you've built so you can atone for sins you don't remember committing? What else can I do? You can let him be dead, really dead. Maren's voice shook. Kier Ashford was a thief and a coward. He hurt people and ran. But Arden Voss didn't do any of that. Arden Voss is just someone trying to survive, with half a life and no past. You don't owe anyone. I owe you. The words were quiet, but absolute. I owe you 3 years of grief. 3 years of believing the man you loved died in a fire when really he just abandoned you. Chose his comfort over your pain. I can't fix that. I can't undo it. But I can try to make right the other things he did, the theft, the fraud. That's something concrete I can address. It will destroy you. Coming forward, admitting to crimes. Even with amnesia, they'll arrest you, prosecute you, you'll go to prison. Maybe that's what should happen. For crimes you don't remember, for actions taken by a person who doesn't exist anymore, he exists in me, in this body, in the consequences of what he did. Arden's jaw set with determination that was purely his own, nothing to do with Kier. I won't run from this. I won't be him in that way. Maren wanted to argue more, wanted to protect him from the impulse toward martyrdom. But she saw the resolution in his face and knew he'd made up his mind long before speaking. This was who Arden was, someone who took responsibility even when he could have easily disclaimed it. Then, at least let me help, she said. Whatever you're going to do, don't do it alone. Maren, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he was carrying. 3 weeks ago, you walked into my archive looking for answers. You found them. Now you don't get to face them alone just because they're ugly. Why would you help me after what you just learned about Kier? Because you're not him. Because you're someone who makes sandwiches for near strangers and sends text messages at 3 a.m. to make sure I'm not alone with dark thoughts. Because you came back when you could have stayed, disappeared. She reached out, took his hand. Because I'm starting to care about you, and I don't want to watch you destroy yourself for someone else's sins. Arden's expression crumbled. For a moment he looked unbearably young, lost in a way that had nothing to do with memory. I don't deserve that, he whispered. Maybe not, but you're getting it anyway. They stood in the small room lined with other people's secrets, holding on to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Outside, the bank continued its mundane operations, tellers counting money, customers depositing checks, the ordinary machinery of finance grinding on. Inside this room, 2 people tried to figure out how to move forward when the past had revealed itself to be irreparably broken. Finally, Arden pulled back. We should look at the rest of it, the documents. Maren didn't want to, but she nodded. They turned back to the safety deposit box. The manila envelope contained what they'd expected: account information, passwords, documentation for the Michael Brennan identity. Bank statements showing deposits totaling nearly $2 million, spread across 3 accounts in different banks. The money was still there, accruing minimal interest, waiting for an owner who'd never claimed it. The documents underneath were worse. Client files, lists of people Kier had stolen from, amounts taken, fabricated explanations for missing funds, elderly couples trusting him with their retirement savings, families who'd hired him to preserve their ancestral estates, people who'd believed in his expertise, his reputation, his carefully cultivated trustworthiness. Maren read through the list, feeling sicker with each name. 17 people. He stole from 17 different clients. Did any of them come forward after the fire? I don't know. There was never a criminal investigation that I heard about. Maybe they didn't realize the money was missing. Maybe they blamed it on the fire destroying records. She set down the papers. Or maybe they're still out there, thinking their money is gone, that they lost it to bad investments or market crashes or whatever lie Kier told them. Arden was reading one of the files, his face ashen. This couple, the Hendersons, he took $400,000 from them over 18 months. They were in their 80s, trusting him to manage their estate so they could leave something to their grandchildren. He looked up. We have to find them, all of them. Return the money. That will require explaining where the money came from, admitting what Kier did. I know. You'll be charged. Even with amnesia, even with everything. The fraud was committed, the victims exist, the evidence is clear. At best, you'll be looking at years of legal battles. At worst, prison. I know. Arden carefully gathered all the documents, the journal, the account information. But I can't live knowing this money exists and people are suffering because of what Kier did. I won't be that person. I refuse to be. They left the bank carrying the contents of the safety deposit box in a nondescript bag that felt like it weighed more than concrete. The drive back was silent. Maren's mind churned, trying to find some way out of this that didn't end with Arden behind bars. But every path led to the same conclusion. The crimes were real. The victims deserved restitution. And Arden, noble, self-destructive Arden, was determined to face consequences for actions he couldn't remember taking. When they reached the archive, neither of them got out of the car immediately. I need to process this, Maren said. All of it. What we learned about Kier, about what he did, about... She stopped. About the fact that I loved someone capable of this. I need time to reconcile that. I understand. I can leave you alone. Give you space." "No." The word came out fiercer than she intended. "Don't leave. I don't want space. I want—" She struggled to articulate what she needed. "I want to be angry. At Kier, at the situation, at the unfairness of you having to carry this. But I don't want to be alone with it." "Then what do you need?" "Time. Just time to feel everything without having to make decisions. Can you give me that? A few days to process before we figure out next steps?" "Of course. Whatever you need." "And Arden?" She turned to look at him. "Don't do anything yet. Don't call lawyers. Don't contact victims. Don't make any moves without talking to me first. Promise me." He hesitated. "Maren, promise me. Because I can see you spiraling into some kind of sacrificial mindset where you think the only way to atone is to destroy yourself completely. And I won't let you do that, not without trying every other option first." "What other options are there?" "I don't know yet, but we'll find them. Together." She squeezed his hand. "Promise me you'll wait." "I promise. 3 days. Then we talk about what comes next." 3 days, she agreed. He left, walking toward the bus stop, with the bag of evidence slung over his shoulder like a physical manifestation of guilt. Maren watched until he was out of sight, then went into the archive and locked the door behind her. She sat at her desk, surrounded by the catalogued remnants of Kier's life, and finally let herself cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears she'd allowed herself over the past 3 years, but harsh, ugly sobs that tore through her chest and left her gasping. She cried for the man she'd loved who'd never really existed. She cried for the victims Kier had stolen from. She cried for Arden, carrying guilt that wasn't his but accepting it anyway because that was who he was. And she cried for herself, for the 3 years of grief that had been based on a lie, for the future she'd planned with someone who'd never intended to be there, for the trust that had been so completely betrayed. When she was empty, hollowed out and exhausted, she sat in the silence and tried to think. There had to be a way through this that didn't end in complete destruction. Some path that allowed restitution without sacrifice, justice without martyrdom. She opened her laptop and began to research. Legal precedents for amnesia and criminal responsibility. Cases of fraud where restitution was made without prosecution. Options for returning stolen money anonymously. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, filling a notebook with possibilities, discarding most of them, circling back to a few that seemed potentially viable. At midnight, her phone buzzed. "Arden, still awake?" She typed back yes, researching legal options. "You should sleep. So should you." "Can't. Keep thinking about the Hendersons. About all of them. Keep wondering how he could have looked them in the eye and stolen from them." He was desperate, and desperate people make terrible choices. That's not an excuse. No, but it's context. Maren paused, then added, "I'm not defending what he did. I'm just saying, people are complex, capable of love and cruelty, generosity and theft. Kier wasn't all bad. He just made irredeemable choices." A long pause. Then, "Do you still love him? Knowing what you know now?" The question stopped her. Did she? Could she love someone who'd done what Kier had done? "I don't know," she typed honestly. "I loved who I thought he was. I don't know if that person ever existed." "I'm sorry. That must be its own kind of grief." "It is. But Arden?" "Yeah? I'm starting to care about who you are. And that's separate from anything I felt for Kier. That's something new, something real." Another long pause. Then, "I don't know how to be someone worth caring about." "You already are. You just don't see it yet." They texted for another hour, about nothing important, just the back and forth of two people who didn't want to be alone with their thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with both of them, and they said goodnight. Maren fell asleep at her desk, her head on her folded arms, surrounded by research and possibilities. She dreamed of fire and water, of documents burning and hands reaching through flames to save something that was already ash. When she woke, the sun was rising, and she had the beginning of a plan. It wasn't perfect. It would require careful execution, discretion, and probably some gray area navigation of the law, but it might allow restitution without complete self-destruction. She pulled out her phone and texted Arden, "I think I found a way. Meet me at the archive at noon. Bring the documents." His response came immediately, as if he'd been awake waiting. "I'll be there." Maren looked around the archive, this place where she'd spent 3 years cataloging the dead, preserving what remained of finished lives. Today, she would start cataloging something different, the possibility of redemption, even for sins you couldn't remember committing. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't erase what Kier had done. But it might be enough to let Arden build something new from the ashes of someone else's mistakes. And that, Maren thought, was the best either of them could hope for. Chapter 6. The Confession. Arden arrived at noon, carrying the bag of documents, an attention that made him look like he hadn't slept at all. Maren had coffee waiting. She'd learned his preferences over the past weeks, the small rituals that made conversation easier, and 2 sandwiches from the cafe, though she doubted either of them would eat. "You found something," he said, setting down the bag. It wasn't a question. "Maybe. Sit down." They sat across from each other, the familiar configuration that had become theirs over the past weeks. Maren pulled out her notebook, pages filled with late-night research and half-formed ideas that had finally coalesced into something resembling a plan. "I've been looking into legal precedents for cases involving amnesia and criminal responsibility," she began. "The law is complicated. In most jurisdictions, amnesia isn't a defense against prosecution. You can't remember committing the crime, but the crime still occurred, and someone has to be held responsible." Arden's expression tightened. "So there's no way out?" "I didn't say that. Let me finish." Maren flipped to a marked page. "There are exceptions. Cases where cognitive impairment is severe enough that the defendant is deemed incompetent to stand trial. Cases where restitution is made voluntarily, and prosecutors decline to press charges in the interest of the victims getting their money back quickly, rather than waiting years for a criminal case to conclude." "You're saying we could return the money without me going to prison?" "I'm saying it's possible. Not guaranteed, but possible." She met his eyes. "Here's what I'm thinking. We identify all the victims from Kier's files. We contact them, anonymously at first, through a lawyer, explaining that funds were misappropriated and are now being returned with interest. We don't identify you as the source. We just facilitate the return." "That's deceptive." "It's strategic. The goal is restitution, right? Getting these people their money back? That happens regardless of whether you publicly confess and go to prison." Arden shook his head. "They deserve to know what happened, to understand they were wronged." "Maybe, but they also deserve their money back, and they deserve it now, not 5 years from now, after a lengthy trial where half of it gets eaten up by legal fees." Maren leaned forward. "I'm not saying we lie. I'm saying we prioritize restitution over punishment. The victims get made whole. You don't destroy the life you've built as Arden. Everyone gets something. Except justice, the abstract concept where people face consequences for their actions. You've been facing consequences for 3 years, living in poverty, isolation, carrying guilt you couldn't even name. How much more punishment do you need before it counts as justice?" Arden was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across Maren's desk. "What about the legal implications if we return the money anonymously? Won't that raise questions? Won't they investigate?" "Probably. But investigations take time. And if the money is returned through proper channels, through a lawyer who maintains attorney-client privilege, there are limits to what authorities can compel, especially if the victims themselves don't want to press charges once they have their money back." "That's a lot of ifs." "It is. But it's better than walking into a police station and confessing to crimes you don't remember committing, then spending the next decade in prison while the victims wait for restitution that might never come." Maren pulled out another page. "I found a lawyer who specializes in this kind of thing. White-collar crime. Restorative justice, working with victims to facilitate restitution outside the criminal justice system. He's expensive, but I have $2 million in stolen money. I can afford expensive. That money isn't yours. I know. But using some of it to return the rest, that's just practical. Arden picked up one of the victim files. The Hendersons, 400,000 stolen. If we returned 450, add 50,000 in interest, that compensates them for the time they've been without their money. Exactly. We do that for all 17 victims. Calculate interest, add a buffer for inconvenience and suffering, return more than was taken. And then? Then we wait. See if anyone comes looking. If they do, we deal with it. If they don't, Marin stopped, uncertain how to finish. If they don't, I get away with it. Arden finished for her. Kier commits fraud, ruins lives, and Arden, who didn't technically do anything, gets to walk away clean. That's not how I'd phrase it. But it's accurate. He set down the file. Marin, I appreciate what you're trying to do. I understand the logic, but I can't. I can't live knowing I profited from someone else's crimes just because I don't remember committing them. You wouldn't be profiting. You'd be facilitating restitution. Using an identity I stole and a life I built on top of someone else's destruction. His voice was tight. Every day I exist as Arden Voss, I'm perpetuating Kier's final lie, that he died, that he escaped consequences. How is that justice? It's not justice. It's survival. Marin's voice rose, despite her attempt to stay calm. And before you martyr yourself on the altar of abstract morality, consider this. You going to prison doesn't help anyone. The victims still have to wait for their money. The legal system still has to spend resources prosecuting someone who genuinely doesn't remember committing crimes. And you get to rot in a cell, punishing yourself for sins that don't feel like yours because they aren't, not in any meaningful sense. They're mine because I'm him. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're someone completely different. Someone who makes bad sandwiches in an inadequate kitchen and texts me at 3 a.m. because you don't want me to be alone with dark thoughts. Someone who spent 3 years living in poverty because you refused to access money you somehow knew was wrong, even without remembering why. She stood, paced to the window. Kier was a coward who ran from consequences. You're someone who came back, who sought answers, who's trying to make things right even though you have every excuse not to. You're not him. Then who am I? The question hung in the air. Marin turned to look at him. This man who wore Kier's face, but inhabited it differently, who carried himself with an uncertainty Kier never had, who looked at her with eyes that held no recognition but somehow more honesty than Kier had ever managed. You're someone trying to become a person worth being, she said quietly, and that's harder and braver than anything Kier ever did. Arden's expression cracked. For a moment he looked like he might cry, but he pulled himself together, took a breath, met her eyes. If we do this, if we return the money anonymously, I need one condition. What? I write letters to each victim, explaining what happened, apologizing, taking responsibility. They might not want them. They might burn them. But I need to. I need them to know that someone acknowledges what was done to them. Marin considered. The lawyer would advise against that. Written confession could be used as evidence. I don't care. I need to do this, Marin. I need some form of accountability beyond just returning money. She saw the resolution in his face and knew this was non-negotiable. All right, you write the letters, but we run them past the lawyer first to make sure they can't be used to prosecute you. Deal. They spent the rest of the afternoon working through logistics. Marin called the lawyer she'd researched, a man named David Corrigan, who specialized in restorative justice and had a reputation for creative solutions to complicated legal problems. She explained the situation in broad strokes. Client with amnesia, discovered he'd committed fraud years ago, wanted to make restitution without going to prison. Corrigan listened without interrupting, then asked pointed questions. How much money? How many victims? What evidence existed? How severe was the amnesia? Finally, this is tricky. If he confesses, even indirectly through letters, he opens himself up to prosecution. But if he returns the money without explanation, the victims might pursue their own investigations, which could lead back to him anyway. So what do you recommend? Marin asked. I'd need to review everything in detail, but preliminarily, yes, we can probably facilitate anonymous restitution. The letters are riskier. I'd want to draft them carefully, focus on acknowledgement and apology without explicit admission of guilt. That defeats the purpose, Arden interjected. He'd been listening on speaker. I want to admit guilt. That's the point. Then you're talking about something other than legal strategy, Corrigan said bluntly. You're talking about moral catharsis, which is admirable but potentially expensive in terms of your freedom. Are you prepared for that? Arden looked at Marin. She could see him weighing options, calculating costs. Finally, how about this? We return the money first, make sure the victims are compensated. Then, after a reasonable period, 6 months, a year, I come forward. Publicly acknowledge what was done, offer to cooperate with any investigation. By then, the victims have their money. They're not dependent on criminal proceedings for restitution. That could work, Corrigan said slowly. Prosecutors might be more inclined toward leniency if restitution has already been made. And your amnesia, if well documented, could be a mitigating factor. You might face reduced charges, probation instead of prison. Or I might face the full extent of the law. Also possible. I can't guarantee outcomes. But this approach gives us more options than an immediate confession. They agreed to meet with Corrigan in person, review all the documentation, and develop a comprehensive strategy. He quoted them a retainer that made Marin wince, $30,000, but Arden agreed without hesitation. It's stolen money anyway. Might as well use it for something constructive. After the call ended, they sat in silence. The afternoon had faded into evening without either of them noticing. Marin's stomach growled, reminding her they'd skipped lunch despite the sandwiches. We should eat, she said. I'm not hungry. Neither am I, but we should eat anyway. They drove to a diner near the archive, a place Marin had frequented during the early days of her grief, when cooking for herself had seemed impossible. They ordered mechanically, burger for him, soup for her, and picked at their food without enthusiasm. I keep thinking about the Hendersons, Arden said, pushing fries around his plate. The file said they were in their 80s when Kier stole from them. They're probably... He stopped. They might not even be alive anymore. They might have died without knowing what happened to their money. We'll find out. Part of the restitution process will be locating all the victims or their estates. And if they are dead, if they died thinking they'd lost everything because of bad luck or their own poor judgment, then we make sure their heirs receive the money. And we live with the fact that some things can't be undone. Marin set down her spoon. Arden, you need to accept that perfect restitution isn't possible. Some damage is permanent. All we can do is mitigate, repair what's repairable, and carry the rest. How do you carry something like this? I don't know, but we'll figure it out. He looked at her then, really looked, with an intensity that made her aware of how close they were sitting in the booth, how their legs were almost touching under the table. Why are you doing this? He asked. Helping me. After what you learned about Kier, after knowing he's whatever I am, why do you care? Marin had been asking herself the same question. The answer wasn't simple or entirely comfortable. Because 3 weeks ago, I was functioning, but not living. Going through motions, cataloging other people's lives while my own stayed frozen. Then you walked in, and... She struggled for words. You reminded me that I'm capable of feeling something other than numb, even if those feelings are complicated and messy, and based on a situation that makes no sense. You mean you care about me because I'm a convenient distraction from your grief? No, I mean you're real, present. You ask hard questions and accept hard answers. You don't perform or pretend. And after 3 years of living with the ghost of someone who performed constantly, who hid his worst parts behind charm, that honesty is valuable to me. Arden was quiet for a long moment. I don't think I'm honest. I think I'm just empty enough that there's nothing to hide. That's not true. You have opinions, preferences, values. You just don't have context for where they came from. Maybe, or maybe I'm just reflecting back what people expect to see. Becoming whatever the situation requires. Is that what you're doing with me? Being what I expect? I don't know what you expect. Neither do I, Marin admitted. I don't know what we're doing or where this goes. I just know that when you're not here, I think about when you will be. And that's new. Frightening, but not bad. It's not bad for me either. Arden's hand found hers on the table, tentative. But I need you to understand, I might not be free to pursue whatever this is. If the legal situation goes badly, if I end up facing charges, prison, I can't ask you to wait for that. You're not asking, I'm choosing. Choosing what? To be here, for as long as it makes sense to be here. She turned her hand over, laced her fingers through his. I've spent 3 years mourning someone who wasn't worth it. I'd rather spend the next however long with someone who is. I'm not sure I am. I am. They finished their meal in silence, but it was different from the heavy silence of earlier. This felt less like drowning and more like possibility. Like maybe there was a way through this that didn't end in complete destruction. When they left the diner, it was fully dark. Arden walked Marin to her car, and they stood in the parking lot, neither quite ready to separate. Tomorrow we start working with Corrigan, Marin said. Figure out how to locate the victims, return the money. It's going to be complicated. I know. And at some point, we should probably talk about this. She gestured between them. What we are, what we're becoming. Do we have to define it? No, but we should probably acknowledge it exists. It exists, Arden said quietly, whatever it is, and I'm grateful for it, even if it's based on the worst circumstances possible. Maybe that's when the most real things happen, in the worst circumstances. He leaned in then, just slightly, and Marin found herself responding, closing the distance. Their kiss was brief, tentative, nothing like the kisses she'd shared with Kier. Those had been confident, assured, the kisses of someone who knew exactly what he wanted. This was uncertain, questioning, a kiss that asked permission even as it happened. When they pulled apart, Arden looked stunned. I don't know if that was appropriate. Appropriate? We're way past appropriate. We're somewhere in the territory of completely unprecedented situation. No rule book available. Is there a rule book for falling for someone while trying to atone for crimes you don't remember committing? If there is, I haven't found it. Marin smiled despite everything. We're making this up as we go. That's terrifying. Yes, but also maybe the only honest way to do this. They said goodnight, and Marin drove home with her lips still tingling, her mind racing. She was attracted to Arden, genuinely, undeniably attracted in a way that had nothing to do with residual feelings for Kier. This was new, specific to him. The way he carried himself, the way he thought, the way he looked at her, like she was someone real rather than someone to perform for. But the situation was impossible. They were building something on a foundation of fraud and amnesia and impending legal consequences. Every logical part of her brain said this was a terrible idea, that she should extract herself before she got more attached. The problem was, she was already attached. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, she'd stopped grieving Kier and started caring about Arden. And that was terrifying and inappropriate and completely beyond her control. That night, she dreamed of the two of them standing at the ruins of the estate. But instead of ash and destruction, wildflowers had grown, thousands of them, covering everything in color. Arden took her hand, and they walked through the flowers together, not speaking, just existing in the same space. When she woke, she couldn't tell if it was prophecy or delusion. She suspected it might be both. Chapter 7. The Choice. The process of returning the money took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of meetings with David Corrigan, of tracking down victims or their heirs, of navigating legal complexities that made Marin's head ache. 6 weeks during which she and Arden existed in a strange liminal space, not quite together, not quite separate, bound by a project that was equal parts restitution and penance. They worked from Marin's apartment now. The archive felt too exposed, too public for the kind of detailed planning they needed to do. So Arden came to her place each morning, bringing coffee and whatever pastries he could afford, and they spent hours at her dining table surrounded by files and spreadsheets and Corrigan's carefully worded correspondence. The first victim they contacted was a widow named Eleanor Morrison. Kier had stolen $90,000 from her over the course of a year, supposedly investing it in estate preservation bonds that never existed. When Corrigan's carefully anonymous letter arrived, informing her that funds had been misappropriated and were now being returned with interest, $110,000, she called the law office immediately. Corrigan put the call on speaker so Marin and Arden could listen. "I don't understand." Mrs. Morrison's voice was elderly, wavering. "Mr. Ashford told me the investments had failed, that the market had crashed. I thought I'd lost everything because I made poor choices." "The investments were misrepresented," Corrigan said carefully. "We're in the process of rectifying multiple cases where funds were improperly managed. Your money is being returned in full, with additional compensation for the time you've been without access to it." "But who is returning it? Is Mr. Ashford alive?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the source. What I can tell you is that restitution is being made, and you should receive a wire transfer within 48 hours. There was a long silence. Then, "I prayed for this. After my husband died, after I thought the money was gone, I prayed that somehow it would come back. I didn't think God heard me." Marin watched Arden's face as he listened. He'd gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. After the call ended, he stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. "She prayed for this," he said, his voice thick. "She lost her husband, lost her money, and she prayed. Because of me, because of what I did. Because of what Kier did. Same thing." He pressed his forehead against the glass. "How many others? How many people prayed, hoped, suffered, because—" 16 more. "And we're going to return money to all of them." Marin joined him at the window. "That's what matters now. Not what Kier did, but what you're doing to fix it. It doesn't fix it. It just redistributes the damage. It's more than most people in his position would do." They contacted the others one by one. Some were grateful, overcome with relief. Others were angry, demanding explanations Corrigan couldn't provide. One man, a retired professor named Thomas Chen, who'd lost $200,000, said simply, "I knew something was wrong. I knew it in my gut, but I trusted the Ashford name. That was my mistake." That call haunted Arden for days. He blamed himself, he kept saying. He thought it was his fault for trusting. "That's what victims do," Marin said. "They internalize blame. It's not rational, but it's common." The Hendersons, as it turned out, were still alive, both in their late 80s, living in a nursing facility. When Corrigan contacted them, their son answered on their behalf. He was suspicious, asked pointed questions about the source of the funds, threatened to involve authorities if there was any impropriety. Corrigan handled it with professional calm. "Your parents were victims of financial fraud. The perpetrator is deceased. These funds are being distributed from the estate as restitution. Everything is documented, legal, above board." The son eventually accepted the money, $475,000, nearly double what had been stolen when interest was calculated. But he remained wary, said he'd be watching for any irregularities. "That's going to be a problem," Corrigan said after the call. "If he pursues his own investigation, he might uncover things we'd prefer stayed buried." "Let him investigate," Arden said. "If he finds out, he finds out. At least his parents have their money back." By the end of the third week, 12 of the 17 victims had been contacted and compensated. 3 were deceased with no traceable heirs. Their money went into a trust fund Corrigan established for fraud victims. 2 couldn't be located despite extensive searching. "We'll keep trying," Corrigan assured them, But realistically, some people don't want to be found. They might have moved, changed names, deliberately dropped off the grid.
We still have their money, Arden said. We can't just
Keep it. We don't keep it. We hold it in escrow, continue searching. If they don't surface within a reasonable time frame, say 5 years, it goes to the victims' fund. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best available. Arden hated it, Marin could tell. He wanted clean resolution, everyone compensated, no loose ends. But life didn't work that way. Some things remained unfinished. The letters were harder. Arden spent hours crafting them, writing and rewriting, trying to find words that conveyed accountability without providing evidence that could be used against him. Corrigan reviewed each one, redacted phrases that were too explicit, added legal hedging that made them less personal but safer. "This isn't what I want to say," Arden protested after Corrigan edited the third draft of a letter to the Hendersons. "It reads like corporate PR, not an actual apology." "That's intentional. An actual apology admits guilt, which opens you up to prosecution. This acknowledges harm while maintaining plausible deniability about your specific involvement." "But that's cowardly." That's exactly what Kier did. Hide behind carefully chosen words instead of telling the truth. Kier ran away completely. Marin interjected. "You're taking responsibility. Just doing it in a way that doesn't guarantee prison. There's a difference." "Is there?" They compromised. The letters acknowledged that funds had been misappropriated, expressed genuine regret for the harm caused, and offered compensation without explicitly stating who was providing it. They weren't as raw or honest as Arden wanted, but they were more personal than standard legal correspondence. Most victims never responded. A few sent brief acknowledgments through Corrigan. Mrs. Morrison sent a handwritten note that simply said, "Thank you for making this right. I forgive you, whoever you are." Arden kept that note in his wallet, took it out sometimes to read, as if the forgiveness of one elderly widow could somehow balance the scale of what Kier had done. In the spaces between legal work and restitution logistics, Marin and Arden found something that resembled normalcy. They cooked dinner together in her small kitchen. Arden was a terrible cook, but enthusiastic, and watching him attempt to follow recipes without burning things had a charm that surprised her. They watched movies on her couch, sitting close but not quite touching, navigating the uncertain territory of whatever they were becoming. They talked late into the night about everything except the situation that had brought them together: books, music, the small observations that made up a life. One evening, 3 weeks into the restitution process, they were washing dishes together when Arden said, "I need to tell you something." Marin's stomach dropped. Those words never preceded good news. "Okay. I've been having more memories. Not full ones, just fragments, flashes." He set down the dish he'd been drying. "Yesterday I remembered proposing to you. Not the whole thing. Just a moment. We were in the library at the estate, and you said yes, and I remember thinking—" He stopped. "What did you think?" "That I didn't deserve you. That I was going to ruin this somehow." He turned to face her. "It's not a full memory. I don't remember our relationship, our history, any of the context. Just that one moment and that one thought. But it felt true. Like I knew, even then, that I was going to destroy what we had." Marin dried her hands slowly, processing. "Are you saying Kier knew he was going to leave me? That it was premeditated?" "I don't know, maybe. Or maybe he just knew he was living a lie, and eventually lies collapse." Arden's expression was troubled. "I keep wondering if the person you loved actually existed. Or if he was always just performance, someone playing the role of a good man while rotting underneath. Does it matter? At this point, does it matter what was real and what was performance? It matters to me. Because if nothing was real, if he never actually loved you, then you spent 3 years mourning someone who never existed. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want you to look at me and see the ghost of someone who never was." Marin stepped closer to him. "When I look at you, I see someone who's trying. Someone who makes bad pasta and sends me texts at 3 a.m. and is torturing himself trying to right wrongs he doesn't remember committing. I see someone real, Arden. Not a ghost. Not a performance. You see what you want to see. Maybe, but isn't that true of everyone? We all see what we're capable of seeing, what we're willing to see. She reached up, touched his face. The scar on his jaw, the line of his cheekbone, features that were Kier's but inhabited differently. I can't speak to what Kier felt, but I know what I feel now, looking at you. And it's not grief, it's not nostalgia, it's something new. What if I disappoint you? What if I turn out to be just another version of him? Then I'll deal with it. But Arden, you've been proving you're not him every day for the past month. You don't get to claim his flaws just because you have his face. He kissed her then, more certainly than he had in the parking lot weeks ago. This kiss was deeper, needier, carrying the weight of everything they'd been navigating. Maren responded, pressing closer, letting herself feel the desire she'd been carefully not acknowledging. His hands found her waist, her back, moving with a hesitancy that was nothing like Kier's confidence but somehow better, more present, more real. They ended up on her couch, tangled together, kissing with an urgency that surprised them both. When Arden pulled back, breathing hard, his expression was dazed. I haven't done this before. I mean, I have, obviously, but I don't remember it, so it feels like... We don't have to, Maren said quickly. We can just... I want to. I'm just... nervous. Which is absurd, being nervous with someone who knew this body before I did. I didn't know this body. I knew Kier's. This is yours, and we're starting from nothing, just like anyone else. She smiled. Besides, I'm nervous too. Why? Because this matters. You matter, and I haven't let anyone matter in 3 years. They took it slowly, not that night, but gradually, over the next week, relearning each other, building intimacy that belonged to them rather than to Kier and Maren. Arden was tentative, careful, constantly checking if things were all right. So different from Kier's smooth confidence that Maren sometimes had to remind herself they were technically the same person. But they weren't. They couldn't be. Because memory and experience were what made someone themselves, and Arden had neither. He was new in every way that mattered. One night, lying together in her bed after making love for the first time, Arden said quietly, I think I'm falling for you. I don't know if that's allowed given everything, but I am. It's allowed, Maren whispered. It's more than allowed. Even though I might end up in prison? Even though we're building this on the worst possible foundation? Even though, she turned to face him, we don't get to choose when we fall for someone. We just fall. And then we decide whether to embrace it or fight it. I'm choosing to embrace it. That might be a mistake. Probably. But I've been playing it safe for 3 years, and all it got me was loneliness. I'd rather take a risk on something real than stay safe in nothing. Arden pulled her closer. I don't know how to be what you need. You already are. You just don't see it yet. They fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time since the fire, Maren didn't dream about flames. She dreamed about water again. But this time, she wasn't floating alone. Someone was there with her, holding her up, keeping her safe. When she woke, Arden was watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made her chest ache. What? She asked. Nothing. Just memorizing, in case I forget again. You won't forget. How do you know? Because this is real, and real things stick. She hoped that was true. She hoped the intimacy they were building would be enough to anchor him, to give him something worth staying for when the legal consequences inevitably caught up with them. Because they would catch up. That was the one certainty in all of this uncertainty. The question was, what would they do when that happened? 6 weeks after they'd opened the safety deposit box, all the restitution was complete. Every victim had been compensated, every letter sent, every dollar returned with interest. The remaining money, about $50,000 after legal fees and compensation, went into the victims, fund Corrigan had established. So that's it. Arden said, reviewing the final documentation. "We're done." "With this part," Corrigan corrected, "now comes the hard decision. Do you come forward and acknowledge what was done, or do you let this remain anonymous?" Arden looked at Marin. They'd been discussing this for days, circling around the question without landing on an answer. "If I come forward, what are we looking at?" Arden asked. "Hard to say. The fact that restitution has been made is significant. Your amnesia is well documented, which could be a mitigating factor. You might face reduced charges, possibly probation instead of prison. But I can't guarantee anything. Some prosecutors view voluntary restitution as evidence of guilt rather than remorse. And if I don't come forward, you continue as Arden Voss. The victims have their money. The fraud remains unsolved officially. You live with the knowledge of what happened, but without legal consequences. That's not justice." "No," Corrigan agreed. "It's pragmatism. Sometimes those are in conflict." After Corrigan left, Marin and Arden sat in silence. The weight of the decision pressed down on them, making the air feel thick, hard to breathe through. "What do you want me to do?" Arden finally asked. "I want you to stay, to not go to prison, to not throw away the life we're building because of abstract concepts like justice and accountability." Marin's voice shook. "But I know that's selfish. I know you need to do what feels right to you. What feels right is coming forward, taking responsibility. But what I want—" He stopped, looked at her with an expression of such conflicted pain it hurt to witness. "What I want is to be with you. To have a future that's not defined by someone else's crimes. But I don't know if I deserve that." "You do deserve it." "How can you say that? After everything you know about Kier, about what he did. You're not him. I keep telling you that, but you don't believe me. You're someone who cleans hospital floors and makes bad pasta and is torturing himself over crimes he doesn't remember committing. That's not Kier. Kier would have taken the money and run and never looked back. You returned it all. You wrote apologies. You're trying to make it right, even though you could have just disappeared." She moved closer to him. "That's who you are, not him. But I have his guilt. I carry it, even if I don't remember earning it. Then put it down. Let Kier be dead, really dead. Not just physically, but let him be gone. Let yourself be someone new." "How?" "By choosing to be. By deciding that whatever Kier did, it ends with returning the money. That you've done enough penance for a life you didn't live." She took his hands. "I'm not saying forget. I'm saying forgive yourself for something you didn't do, and then live." Arden was quiet for a long time. Marin could see him wrestling with the decision, weighing justice against survival, accountability against the possibility of happiness. Finally, he said, "If I don't come forward, if I stay as Arden, I need to live differently, not just exist in a single room working night shifts. I need to build something, be someone, prove that the choice to stay hidden is worth something. What does that look like? I don't know yet. But something that helps people, something that balances the scales, even if indirectly. We could do that, together. You'd stay? Even if I choose not to confess? Even if I'm technically getting away with fraud?" "You're not getting away with anything. You've returned everything. You've made restitution. The legal system would just be extra punishment for punishment's sake, and I don't see how that helps anyone." Arden pulled her close, held her tightly. "I don't know if this is the right choice, but it's the one I'm making. For you, for us, for whatever future we might have. Then that's enough." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the silence of Marin's apartment, while the afternoon light faded and evening settled around them. The decision was made. They would go forward as Arden and Marin, leaving Kier in the past where he belonged. It wasn't justice, it wasn't even closure, really. But it was survival. And sometimes, survival was the most moral choice available. That night, as they lay in bed together, Arden said quietly, "I love you." "I don't know if I've earned the right to say that, but I do." Marin felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too, not who you were, who you are." Promise me something. What? If the amnesia ever lifts, and I remember everything Kier did, everything he felt, promise me you'll help me figure out how to live with it. How to be myself instead of him. I promise. And if I can't? If the memories are too much then we'll deal with it. Together. Whatever comes. Arden kissed her forehead, her temple, her mouth. I don't deserve you. Maybe not, but you're getting me anyway. They made love again, slower this time, with a tenderness that felt like promises neither of them could articulate. And afterward, as Arden fell asleep beside her, Maren lay awake thinking about choices and consequences, about how sometimes the most moral thing wasn't the most just, and how love could grow in the ruins of something that had burned to the ground. She thought about Kier, about the man she'd mourned who'd never really existed, and she thought about Arden, who was real in all the ways Kier hadn't been, flawed and uncertain and present. She chose Arden. She chose this life, built on complicated foundations, morally ambiguous but emotionally true. And if that made her complicit, if it made her an accessory to letting someone escape consequences, well, she'd live with that. Because the alternative was losing him, and she'd lost enough. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, people living and dying, making choices, facing consequences, surviving. And in Maren's small apartment, two people held on to each other, choosing survival, choosing each other, choosing to believe that sometimes redemption looked like simply refusing to keep punishing yourself for sins you couldn't remember committing. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough, and enough, they decided, was all they needed. Chapter 8. The Rebuilding. Spring came gradually, the way it did in coastal cities, not with a dramatic shift, but with slow accumulation. Longer days, warmer afternoons, trees budding green along the streets. Maren walked to work. 6 months had passed, since the safety deposit box, since the decision to let Kier stay dead and let Arden live. They'd moved in together 3 months ago, not to Maren's apartment. It was too small, too full of the ghost of who she'd been during her years of grief, but to a new place neither of them had history with, a modest 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse, with large windows that let in light, and a view of the harbor that Arden photographed obsessively, documenting the way water changed with weather and time. He'd quit his hospital job, used some of the money he'd saved, legitimate money, earned through night shifts and careful budgeting, to buy actual camera equipment. Started taking photography seriously, not just as documentation, but as art. His work was good, Maren thought. Raw and honest in ways that reflected who he was. Images that found beauty in decay, hope in ruins, light in overlooked corners. He sold his first photograph 2 months ago. A local gallery owner had seen his portfolio and offered to display 3 pieces. One sold within a week. A study of wildflowers growing through cracked pavement near the old estate ruins. The buyer was an elderly woman who said it reminded her that life persisted even after destruction. Arden had cried when he got the news. Someone wanted something I made, he'd said, incredulous. Not something Kier did, something I created. You're building a life, Maren had told him, a real one. Yours. He was trying. She could see it in the small ways he was becoming more present, more certain of himself. He still had nightmares sometimes, fragmentary memories of fire and guilt that woke him gasping, but they were less frequent now. And when they came, she was there, holding him, anchoring him to the present. The legal situation remained unresolved in the technical sense. No one had come looking. No investigations had been opened. The victims had their money, and as far as the world knew, the Ashford fraud had died with Kier in the fire. Corrigan called every few months to check in, to remind them that the statute of limitations for fraud was typically 5 years, and they were halfway through that window. If you make it to year 5 without anyone coming forward, he'd said during their last call, you're probably clear. The cases would be much harder to prosecute after that, especially with the restitution already made. 2.5 more years. They just had to survive 2.5 more years of looking over their shoulders, of wondering if today would be the day someone connected the dots. Most days, Maren didn't think about it. She was too busy living, actually living, not just existing the way she had for 3 years after Kier's disappearance. She'd changed jobs 6 weeks ago, leaving the archive for a position as a curator at a small private museum that focused on local history. The work was more engaging, more present-focused, less about cataloging the dead, and more about bringing the past to life for people who cared to learn from it. She and Arden had dinner parties now, small ones, just a few colleagues from her new job, a couple Arden had met through the gallery. They were building a life with witnesses, with connections, with the ordinary infrastructure that made existence feel real rather than provisional. One evening in late April, they were cooking together. Arden had gotten slightly less terrible at it, though Maren still supervised anything involving sharp knives, when he said, "I've been thinking about something." "Dangerous," Maren teased, but her stomach tightened. Conversations that started like this rarely ended well. "Not bad thinking. At least, I don't think it's bad." He set down the vegetables he'd been chopping. "I want to do more, with my life. Not just photography. I want to help people. Like the victims helped themselves by accepting restitution. I want to be part of that process for others." "What do you mean?" "I've been researching fraud recovery programs, organizations that help victims of financial crimes navigate restitution, rebuild their lives. I thought maybe I could volunteer, use my experience, even if I have to be vague about the details, to help people who've been through what Kier's victims went through." Maren set down her wineglass. That's actually a beautiful idea. But Arden, are you sure? Working that close to the thing you're trying to move past, won't that be difficult? Probably, but it also feels necessary. Like I can't just take the forgiveness Mrs. Morrison offered and do nothing with it. I need to pay it forward somehow. You don't owe anyone anything else. You've done enough. Have I? I returned money. That's just correcting an error. It's not actually contributing anything new, anything positive. He moved closer to her. I want to build something that matters. Something that proves the choice to stay alive, to not confess, was worth it because of what I can do with the second chance. Maren studied his face, the earnestness there, the need to transform guilt into purpose. She understood it, even worried about it. There was a fine line between healthy restitution and self-destructive penance. "All right," she said, "but slowly. Start small. See how it feels. And if it becomes too much, if it's re-traumatizing, you step back. Deal?" "Deal." He started volunteering 2 weeks later, 3 afternoons a week, at an organization called Fresh Start Financial. They worked with fraud victims, helping them understand their rights, navigate the legal system, rebuild their financial lives after being scammed or stolen from. Arden didn't tell them his full story, just said he'd been affected by financial fraud and wanted to help others through similar situations. He was good at it, empathetic in ways that came from genuine understanding, patient in ways that reflected his own struggles with piecing together a fractured life. The organization's director, a woman named Sandra Chen, mentioned to Maren at a fundraiser that Arden was one of their best volunteers. "He has this way of making people feel seen," she said. "Not judged, not pitied, just understood. It's rare." Maren watched Arden across the room, talking with an elderly man who'd been scammed out of his retirement savings. Arden's body language was open, attentive. The man was crying, and Arden handed him tissues without making it awkward, just acknowledging the emotion as valid and necessary. "He's pretty special," Maren said. "You're lucky to have found him." "I am." Though found wasn't quite the right word. She'd lost someone, and in the empty space that loss created, someone new had appeared, not a replacement. Arden could never replace Kier because they were fundamentally different people, but something better, something real. On the anniversary of the fire, 3.5 years after Kier's disappearance, they drove to the ruins together. It had become a ritual, though Maren wasn't sure when or how. Every year on that date, they went to where the estate had stood, planted wildflowers in the ash-mixed soil, and sat in silence, acknowledging what had been lost and what had been found. This year, the wildflowers from previous visits had spread, creating patches of color among the overgrown grass and crumbling stone. The new owners still hadn't done anything with the land. Maren had heard rumors they were waiting for property values to increase before developing, so the ruins remained, a memorial to destruction and the stubborn persistence of growing things. They planted new flowers, purple coneflowers this time, native plants that could survive with minimal care. Arden had researched which varieties would thrive in the specific soil conditions, approaching even this small task with the careful attention he brought to everything. After planting, they sat on the old foundation stones, looking out over what had once been the estate's back lawn. "Do you ever wish I'd remembered?" Arden asked. "That the amnesia had lifted and I'd become Kier again?" Maren considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. In the beginning, definitely. I wanted you to remember so badly it physically hurt. I thought if you remembered it would validate what we'd had, prove it was real. And now? Now I'm grateful you don't. Because the person I love is you, and you wouldn't exist if Kier's memories had come back. You'd just be him, dealing with guilt and shame and all the things that drove him to burn his life down." She took his hand. "I'd rather have you whole and uncertain than have him back broken by what he'd done. I might still remember someday." The neurologist said it's possible, even years later. "If you do, we'll deal with it. But Arden, even if every memory comes back, you're still you. Memory doesn't erase the person you've become over the past 3.5 years. Doesn't it? If I remember loving you as Kier, remember proposing, remember planning to abandon you, how do I reconcile that with loving you now? The same way I reconciled loving Kier with loving you. You accept that people are complex, that we contain multitudes, that who we were and who we are don't have to be the same." Arden was quiet, processing. Then, "I had another fragment of memory last week, a conversation with my father, years before he died. He was telling me about family legacy, about responsibility to the Ashford name, and I remember thinking, I don't want this. Any of it. I want to be someone else." "Did you tell me about this memory?" "No. I wanted to sit with it first, figure out what it meant." He turned to look at her. "I think part of Kier always wanted to disappear. Not because of the fraud that came later, but because the weight of being an Ashford, of maintaining the estate and the legacy and the expectations, it was suffocating him long before the money ran out. So the fire was what? An extreme form of self-liberation? Maybe. Or maybe it was just cowardice dressed up as necessity." He picked up a stone, turned it over in his hands. "I'll never know what he was really thinking. I have fragments, impressions, but not the full picture. And I think I'm okay with that now. Not knowing everything, living with uncertainty. That's growth. Or resignation." Growth and resignation look similar sometimes. They sat until the afternoon light began to golden, until the shadows grew long across the ruins. As they were leaving, Arden took photographs, not of the destruction, but of the wildflowers, the life that persisted, the color against gray stone. "These are for the next show," he said. "I want to do a series about rebuilding, about what grows in places that have burned." That's heavy-handed as metaphor goes. I know, but it's also true. On the drive back, Maren's phone rang, an unknown number. She answered cautiously. Unknown numbers always made her nervous now. Always carried the possibility of someone finally connecting the dots, asking questions they'd rather not answer. "Is this Maren Holt?" The voice was male, elderly, unfamiliar. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Robert Henderson. My wife Eleanor and we received money a few months ago. The lawyer said it was restitution for fraud committed by a man named Kier Ashford." Maren's blood went cold. She glanced at Arden, who'd heard enough through the speaker to look alarmed. "I'm familiar with the case," Maren said carefully. "I used to work as an archivist, catalog some of the Ashford estate materials after the fire." "Yes, the lawyer mentioned you might have been connected to the family. I'm calling because, well, Eleanor wanted me to thank you. If you had any role in returning that money, it changed our lives. We'd been living on very little, trying to make our savings stretch. That money meant we could move into a better facility, get Eleanor the medical care she needs. She wanted you to know. She's grateful. We both are." Marin felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad the money helped. That's what mattered. Making sure people were taken care of. Eleanor also wanted me to tell you. She forgives him, Mr. Ashford. She knows he's dead, knows he can't hear her forgiveness, but she wanted it said anyway. She said anger was too heavy to carry, and she'd rather be grateful for what came back than bitter about what was taken. That's very generous of her. She's a generous woman. Always has been. Anyway, I just wanted to call, say thank you. If you were involved in any way, it meant the world to us, both of us." After they hung up, Marin sat in silence, processing. Arden had pulled over, parked on the side of the road. "The Hendersons," he said. His wife wanted to say thank you, and that she forgives you. Him, Kier. Marin's voice shook. "She forgives you." Arden put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook. Marin reached over, held him while he cried. Not from sadness, she thought, but from relief. From the weight of receiving forgiveness he'd never thought he deserved. When he'd composed himself, he said, "I don't know what to do with that, with being forgiven." You accept it, and you keep trying to be someone worthy of it. How? By doing exactly what you're doing, living honestly, helping people, building something good from the ruins of something terrible. She cupped his face in her hands. "You're doing it, Arden. You're already doing it." They drove home in silence, but it was a different silence than the heavy one they'd carried before. This felt lighter, like something had been released. The Hendersons. Forgiveness wouldn't erase what Kier had done, wouldn't make the fraud disappear. But it offered something they both desperately needed, permission to move forward without the full weight of the past crushing them. That night, lying in bed, Arden said, "I want to marry you." Marin's breath caught. "What?" "Not now, not immediately, but someday. When we're further from all of this. When it feels less like we're building on quicksand." He turned to face her. "I want to promise you a future. Not as Kier trying to make up for abandoning you, but as Arden, choosing you, wanting to build a life with you. We can't, legally. You don't technically exist as Arden Voss in any official capacity. You'd have to use Kier's identity, and that... I know, I've thought about that, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe I need to reclaim that identity, not to be him, but to make it mean something different. To take the name that committed fraud and make it stand for something better. That's complicated. Everything about us is complicated. But Marin, I love you. Not despite everything, not in spite of our impossible situation. Just because of who you are, who we are together, and I want to make that permanent somehow." Marin felt tears prick her eyes. "I want that too, but Arden, we have to be realistic. The legal complications alone. We have time to figure it out. I'm not asking you to marry me tonight. I'm just saying I want to, eventually, when it makes sense, if it ever makes sense. And if it never does, if the legal situation is always too complicated, then we make our own commitments, outside the legal system. We don't need the government's permission to choose each other." Marin kissed him, soft and deep, trying to pour into the kiss everything she felt and couldn't quite articulate. When they pulled apart, she said, "Ask me again, in a year, after we've survived longer, built more. Ask me then, and I'll say yes. Promise?" "Promise." They made love that night with a tenderness that felt like vows they couldn't speak yet. And afterward, tangled together in sheets that smelled like them, like their combined lives, their shared space. Marin thought about how strange it was that the worst thing that had ever happened to her had somehow led to the best thing. Kier burning down his life had destroyed her. But from those ashes, she and Arden had built something new. Something that was theirs, untainted by Kier's lies, because it was built on truth. The terrible truth of what he'd done, and the simple truth of two people choosing each other despite impossibly complicated circumstances. It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no redemption arc, no grand gesture that erased past sins. Just two people, flawed and uncertain, trying to build a future from the ruins of someone else's choices. But it was real, it was honest, and it was enough. Outside, the city slept. In her small apartment years ago, Maren had spent countless nights awake, mourning a man who'd never really existed. Now, in their shared home, she slept soundly, held by someone who did. The nightmares still came sometimes, for both of them, but when they did, they woke together, reminded each other where they were, who they were, reminded each other that they'd survived, were surviving, would continue to survive. That was all redemption ever really was, Maren thought, as she drifted toward sleep. Not dramatic transformation, but quiet persistence. Getting up each day and choosing again. Choosing to try, to build, to love, despite evidence that the world was cruel and people were capable of terrible things. Choosing to believe that sometimes, in the spaces between loss and finding, something new could grow. Something fragile but real. Something that, with care and time and stubbornness, might become unshakable. She chose to believe that. And so did he. And in the choosing, they made it true. Epilogue, What Remains? 2 years later. Maren stood at the window of their apartment, watching rain streak the glass. The harbor below was gray, obscured by mist, boats rocking gently at their moorings. The weather matched the occasion, heavy, uncertain, requiring navigation. Behind her, Arden was getting dressed, fumbling with the tie he rarely wore. She could hear him cursing softly, the small, intimate sounds of frustration that she'd grown to find endearing rather than irritating. "Need help?" she called. "No, I've got it. Probably." A pause. "Actually, yes, please." She crossed the room, took the tie from his hands, and knotted it efficiently. Her fingers had done this hundreds of times for Kier muscle memory that served a different purpose now. Arden's collar was different, his throat thinner, his shoulders less broad. Small differences that added up to someone entirely separate. "Thank you," he said, studying his reflection. "Do I look okay?" "You look fine. Nervous, but fine." "I am nervous. Wouldn't you be?" "Terrified," Maren admitted. Today was the day. 5 years and 2 months since the fire. 5 years since Kier Ashford had disappeared, since the fraud had been committed. The statute of limitations had passed 6 weeks ago, but they'd waited additional time to be certain, consulting with Corrigan, until he'd finally said, "You're clear. Legally, no one can prosecute you now, even if they wanted to." And now Arden was going to do something Maren had argued against for weeks. He was going to publish an essay. Not a confession exactly. Corrigan had vetted it carefully to ensure it couldn't retroactively open legal doors that were now closed, but an acknowledgement, an explanation. The essay was titled On Living with Stolen Time. It told the story of a man who woke up with amnesia, discovered he'd committed fraud, and spent years making restitution while building a new life. It didn't name Kier Ashford explicitly, didn't provide details that could identify victims, but anyone who cared to dig would be able to connect the dots. "You don't have to do this," Maren said, adjusting his collar. "We could just let it stay buried. Live our lives. No one would know." "I would know." Arden's hands found her waist. "And I need people to understand, not to forgive me, not to absolve me, but to understand that redemption isn't about erasing what happened. It's about what you build afterward. Some people won't see it that way. They'll just see someone who committed crimes and got away with it. I know. And maybe they're right. Maybe I am getting away with it. But I need to at least acknowledge what happened. Let people judge for themselves." The essay was being published in a literary magazine that specialized in long-form narrative nonfiction. It had already been accepted, fact-checked, edited. Today was publication day. By this evening, thousands of people would read Arden's story. By tomorrow, there would be responses, think pieces, social media discussions, probably angry emails. Maren had made peace with it, or as close to peace as she could get. She understood why he needed to do this, even if she disagreed with the necessity. Arden had spent 5 years carrying the weight of what Kier had done. Writing about it, shaping it into something comprehensible, was his way of finally setting down that weight. "Ready?" she asked. "No, but let's go anyway." They drove to the magazine's office for a small reception, just the editor, a few staff members, Arden's volunteer coordinator from Fresh Start Financial, who'd written a companion piece about his work there. Marin stood beside him as he made awkward small talk, accepted congratulations that felt surreal given the essay's content. The editor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Liu, pulled Marin aside at one point. "Thank you for letting him tell this story," she said. "I didn't let him. He chose to. I just didn't stop him." That's generous in its own way. Not many partners would be comfortable with this level of public exposure. "I'm not comfortable. I'm just accepting." Patricia smiled. "That's the harder thing, isn't it? Accepting rather than controlling. My wife says I'm terrible at it." After the reception, they went home and waited. Arden checked his phone obsessively, reading responses as they came in. Most were thoughtful, engaging with the questions he'd raised about identity and responsibility. Some were angry, calling him a criminal, saying he'd minimized his crimes, arguing that he deserved prison regardless of restitution. One email came directly to Arden's public account. It was from Thomas Chen, the retired professor who'd lost $200,000. "I read your essay. I won't pretend to understand amnesia or the complexities of your situation, but I wanted you to know. Receiving that money back changed my life. I was able to retire with dignity, to leave something to my children. You say you don't deserve forgiveness. Maybe you don't. But you have my thanks, for whatever that's worth." T.C. Arden read the email 3 times, then showed it to Marin with shaking hands. "He doesn't forgive me," Arden said, "but he thanks me. I think that might be better, more honest." "Why?" "Because forgiveness implies debt erased. Thanks implies recognition without absolution. I did something terrible. I tried to make it right. Both things can be true." That night, they lay in bed scrolling through responses. Most were measured, complex, wrestling with the same questions Marin and Arden had been wrestling with for years. A few were hostile. One particularly thoughtful essay response questioned whether publishing this story was itself a form of redemption-seeking, whether Arden was using vulnerability as currency to buy moral credit. "They might be right," Arden said, reading that one aloud. "Maybe I am seeking redemption I haven't earned. Or maybe you're just trying to be honest about an impossible situation. Not every action has to be redemptive. Sometimes it's just documentation." "Is that what this is? Documentation?" "I think it's whatever people need it to be. For some it'll be a confession. For others, a cautionary tale. For a few, maybe proof that people are more complicated than simple moral categories allow." Arden set down his phone. "Do you think I did the right thing? Publishing this?" Marin thought about it honestly. "I think you did what you needed to do. Whether it's right, that's for other people to judge. I just love you regardless. Even though I'm someone who committed fraud and avoided legal consequences, you didn't commit fraud, Kier did. We've been through this. Same body, same, different person, and I'll keep saying it until you believe me." She rolled over to face him. "You've spent 5 years making amends. You've helped dozens of fraud victims rebuild their lives. You've created art that speaks truth about pain and survival. You've loved me in ways Kier never managed. That's who you are, not some guy who stole money before losing his memory. Both things are true. Yes, but one is past and finished. The other is present and ongoing." They fell asleep eventually, tangled together the way they always were now. Marin had gotten used to his presence, the way he breathed, the small sounds he made, the warmth of him beside her. She'd gotten used to not being alone. In the morning, there was more response to the essay. A victims advocacy group wanted to interview Arden. 2 podcasts requested appearances. A literary agent emailed asking if he'd considered expanding the essay into a memoir. "A memoir," Arden said, incredulous. Who wants to read an entire book about this? Apparently, several people, but you don't have to do any of it. The essay was enough. You've said what you needed to say. Maybe. Or maybe... He stopped, thinking, what if I did write more? Not about the fraud, but about rebuilding, about what it's like to construct an identity from nothing. That might actually help people. People with amnesia? People who've lost themselves for any reason. Trauma, addiction, grief. People who need to figure out how to become someone new because who they were isn't accessible anymore. Marin considered it. That's actually a beautiful idea. But, Arden, write it for yourself first. Worry about publication later. All right, I can do that. He started writing the next day. Not the memoir exactly, but essays. Fragments about identity and memory. About living without a past. About building a life from available materials. He wrote about the hospital floors he'd cleaned. About the first photograph he'd sold. About the moment he'd realized he was falling for someone he'd technically been engaged to in a previous life. Some of it was beautiful. Some was raw to the point of discomfort. All of it was honest. Marin read the essays as he finished them, offering feedback when asked, mostly just bearing witness to his process of making sense of an impossible situation. One evening, 3 months after the first essay published, Arden came home from his volunteer shift looking troubled. What's wrong? Marin asked. Nothing wrong exactly. Just, Sandra wants to promote me, make me a paid staff member instead of a volunteer. She says I'm too valuable to keep giving my time for free. That's wonderful. Why do you look like someone died? Because it means stepping fully into this identity. Filing taxes as Arden Voss, having employment records, creating a paper trail. And I realized I've been living in limbo. Keeping Arden as this provisional identity in case I needed to become Kier again, for legal reasons. But if the statute of limitations has passed, if I'm really clear, then I need to commit. Become Arden fully, legally, permanently. Is that what you want? I think so. Kier is dead. Really dead, not just legally. I don't want to resurrect him. I want to be Arden. He sat down heavily. But it feels like burial. Final burial. And I know that doesn't make sense. Mourning someone I don't remember being, but it makes perfect sense. You're saying goodbye to a possibility. The possibility that you might remember, might reclaim that life. Choosing Arden permanently means accepting that Kier is truly gone. And if he was never worth keeping, then his loss is no loss. But Arden, who you've become, is absolutely worth keeping. They talked late into the night about logistics, how to establish Arden's identity more formally, what legal steps were needed, how to navigate the gray areas of being someone who didn't officially exist. Corrigan helped again, found pathways through bureaucracy, filed paperwork that created a more solid foundation for Arden's existence. 6 months later, Arden Voss was official. Social security number, driver's license, employment records. He was real in every way that mattered to the state. How does it feel? Marin asked when the final documents came through. Weird, final, but also freeing. Like I can stop looking over my shoulder now. You could have stopped years ago. No, I had to earn it first, and I think maybe now I have. That night, he proposed. Not with a ring. Those felt too weighted with Kier's history, but with a promise. I want to choose you, he said, taking her hands. Not as someone making amends for abandoning you, but as someone who loves you, who wants to build a life with you, who chooses you every day and wants to keep choosing you for whatever time we have. We can't marry legally, not with your history, the complications. I don't care about legal, I care about us. We can have a ceremony, make promises, invite the people who matter. We don't need the state's permission to commit to each other. Marin felt tears on her face before she realized she was crying. Yes, I want that. They married in the spring, 5 years and 8 months after the fire. A small ceremony at the ruins of the estate, where wildflowers had spread so extensively that the destruction was barely visible beneath the growth. 20 people attended. Friends, colleagues, Arden's supervisor from Fresh Start Financial, the gallery owner who'd given him his first show. Corrigan came and served as unofficial officiant, reading words they'd written themselves, about choosing each other, about building from ruins, about the stubborn persistence of growing things. Marin wore a simple dress, nothing bridal. Arden wore the suit he'd bought for the essay publication. They exchanged promises that weren't legally binding but felt more real than any document. "I choose you," Arden said. "Not because of who you were to someone else, but because of who you are to me. You saw me when I was nothing but questions and fragments, and you helped me become someone with answers, or at least someone comfortable with questions." "I choose you," Marin responded, "not despite our complicated history, but because of what we've built from it. You taught me that endings can be beginnings, that loss can lead to finding, that sometimes the person you need shows up wearing the face of someone you lost." They kissed as newly married in every way except legal, and their small gathering cheered, and Marin thought, this is what redemption looks like. Not dramatic transformation, not grand gestures, but small promises kept. Days accumulated into months, months into years, years into a life. At the reception afterward, held at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor, Mrs. Morrison appeared. Marin hadn't invited her, hadn't even known she was aware of the wedding, but there she was, tiny and elegant in a lavender dress. "I hope you don't mind me coming," she said to Arden. "I saw the announcement in the paper, your real name, I mean, Arden Voss. And I wanted to—" She stopped, pulled a small wrapped box from her purse. "I wanted to give you this." Arden opened it carefully. Inside was a handkerchief, embroidered with the words, "Begin again." "My mother made it for me when my first husband died," Mrs. Morrison said. "She told me that ending and beginning are just two sides of the same door. I thought you might need the reminder that you're allowed to begin, that you've earned it." Arden hugged her, this elderly woman he'd stolen from and repaid, who'd offered forgiveness he hadn't asked for. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "Thank you," he managed, "for this, for everything." "Thank you for giving me back hope," she replied, "for showing me that people can change, that amends can be made. I needed that as much as I needed the money." After she left, Arden and Marin stood together on the restaurant's balcony, looking out over the water. The sun was setting, painting everything gold. "Do you ever regret it?" Arden asked. "Choosing this life instead of, I don't know, moving on completely, finding someone uncomplicated?" "Every relationship is complicated. Ours is just more obviously so." Marin leaned against him. "And no, I don't regret it. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." "How do you know?" "Because I'm happy. Actually happy, not performing happiness. And I haven't been happy in, maybe ever. Not like this." "Me neither." "Which is strange to say, given everything." "Not strange, just true." She turned to face him. "We built something good from something terrible. That's worth celebrating." They stayed on the balcony until the sun disappeared completely, until stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Behind them, their small gathering continued. Laughter, conversation, the ordinary sounds of people enjoying each other's company. And Marin thought about how far they'd come from that morning when Arden had walked into her archive looking for answers. How neither of them had known what they'd find, what it would cost, what it would become. The journey hadn't been clean. There had been no redemption arc, no moment of catharsis where everything became clear and resolved. Just slow accumulation of better choices, of small repairs, of learning to live with complexity rather than demanding simplicity. But it had been enough, more than enough. It had been real. And real, Marin had learned, was better than any fantasy, better than the life she'd planned with Kier, which had been built on lies and performances, better than the grief she'd carried for 3 years, which had been easier than facing the truth. This, standing on a balcony with someone who'd chosen her every day for 5 years, who'd rebuilt himself from nothing and included her in the rebuilding, this was what she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." Simple words. But they meant something different now than they had before. They weren't promises of forever, weren't guarantees against future pain. They were just acknowledgement of this moment, this choice, this shared life built from available materials. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Years later, Maren never counted how many, found that counting seemed to diminish things rather than honor them. She would think about that night, about the wedding at the ruins, about Mrs. Morrison's gift, about the way Arden had looked at her as the sun set. She would think about how love could grow in the strangest places, how endings and beginnings were indeed two sides of the same door, how sometimes the worst thing that ever happened could somehow lead to the best thing, though the path between was neither straight nor clear. She would think about Kier sometimes too, not with anger anymore, or grief or betrayal, just with a kind of distant acknowledgement. He had existed. He had made terrible choices, and from the ashes of those choices, something new had grown. She didn't forgive him, but she didn't need to. Forgiveness was irrelevant when the person no longer existed to receive it. What mattered was what remained, what persisted. And what persisted was Arden, flawed, uncertain, present, building a life one careful choice at a time, loving her in ways that were honest rather than grand. What persisted was them, together, navigating complexity, choosing each other despite and because of everything they'd survived. What persisted was the stubborn insistence that life could be built from ruins, that growth could happen in ash, that sometimes the most moral thing wasn't the most just but was still worth doing. That was the truth they'd learned, the hard-won wisdom of people who'd been tested by impossible circumstances and emerged scarred but functional, damaged but whole enough. It wasn't a happy ending. Those didn't exist for people like them, but it was an honest one, a real one, a gentle one in its way. And gentle, Maren thought, was underrated. Gentleness after violence, tenderness after cruelty, care after abandonment. That was the story they'd written together. Not a romance, exactly, not a redemption tale. Just two people learning to live, learning to love, learning that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was simply refuse to keep punishing yourself for being human. And in that refusal, finding something that looked almost like peace, almost like home, almost like always. The end.